Hey guys, tonight we're stepping quietly into the blood-slicked back corridors of an empire that stretched across 3 continents and 6 centuries, but tonight, you're not here for the conquests or the glittering palaces. No, you're sneaking behind velvet curtains and through creaking iron gates, where fewer feet dared to tread. Welcome to the hidden world of Ottoman punishments, the kinds of things whispered about by trembling servants, scribbled in the margins by scandalized scribes, and buried beneath centuries of golden domes and elaborate tilework. You'll smell jasmine and blood, hear lullabies mixed with the clink of chains, and maybe, just maybe, you'll make it through the night with your head still on your shoulders. No promises. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your city and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind blows soft through the imperial gardens of Topkapi Palace, rustling the leaves of ancient cypress trees. You walk slowly beneath their branches, your shoes muffled against the worn stone paths. On the surface, it's peaceful. There's a gentle fountain trickling somewhere nearby, a soft echo of a flute, maybe a servant singing to herself in a hidden courtyard. But this is only one layer of the story. The palace has others, buried like bones beneath marble and silk. You're not heading to the banquet hall or the Sultan's audience chamber. You're tracing the footsteps of men who never returned. One hallway turns, then turns again, until you find yourself facing a door that looks just a bit too plain for such a lavish palace. Behind it, the air changes cooler, stiller, the scent of sandalwood fading into something faintly metallic. You pass beneath low arches where the plaster is flaking, where old shadows cling like cobwebs. It's here, the whispers start. Some say this is where a scribe was found slumped over his ledger, his throat cut so cleanly the ink hadn't yet dried on his final sentence. Others speak of a eunuch who failed to close a door quickly enough and was never seen again. You glance over your shoulder, half expecting someone in a silken turban to be following you, eyes like coals, a velvet cord coiled in his hand. But no one's there. Just the walls and their stories. The Ottoman Empire had a thing for symbolism. Nothing was ever just about punishment. It was performance, power, and a sort of morbid artistry. Crime and discipline weren't whispered about, they were demonstrated. And nowhere was this more evident than in the preferred methods used within these very palace walls. Let's start with a crowd favorite, strangulation. Not with rope, not with wire, but with luxurious silk. Because if you're going to execute a royal, you might as well do it with style. The bowstring, a finely woven cord of silk, was reserved almost exclusively for nobility. Executing someone with a blade, too messy. A firing squad, too Western. But a strangler, slipping up behind you with silent footsteps and winding a silk cord around your throat that was properly Ottoman and oddly intimate. Sometimes it took 2 men pulling in unison, one on each side, like some deadly tug of war. Historians still argue whether this was a sign of Mercino blood spilled, after a particularly cruel ritual cloaked in elegance. You can almost picture it now. A brother, summoned to the palace under the guise of tea and conversation. A servant leading him not into the salon, but into a smaller, quieter room with no windows. And there too, burly mute executioners, their heads bowed, waiting. No screaming. Just a slow, choking struggle, while the scent of rosewater lingers. It wasn't always announced. Sometimes the Sultan would simply tap his ring on the arm of his chair. Other times, the condemned would notice the room was a little too quiet. The bowstring wasn't just about killing, it was about control, about fear stitched into every seam of court life. Some nobles walked into palace chambers with their own food tasters, their own personal guards, their own last will tucked into their robes. But here's the quirkier bit. The executioners themselves were kept on a tight leash, not literally, but close. They were officially mute. trained not to speak, not to look anyone in the eye, not to ever show an opinion about the bloody work they did. Their silence wasn't just practical, it was theatrical. Their presence in the palace was like the distant growl of thunder on a warm evening. You might not see the storm, but you never forgot it was there. You lean against a wall, the stone cool against your back, and listen. Somewhere nearby, a door opens and closes with that particular heaviness. Old wood develops over centuries. It's not hard to imagine a noble waiting outside that very room for a private audience with the Sultan, fingers twitching, unsure whether the next conversation will end with tea or silk. Court etiquette demanded calm. Even in fear, even in those last moments, dignity mattered. Losing your temper? Not fashionable. Losing your composure? Worse than death. You were expected to die beautifully. One of the more whispered about features of Topkapi was a certain quiet room near the Imperial Divan Hall. It was known colloquially as the Chamber of Farewell, where some royals were politely escorted before disappearing. No guards dragged you screaming. You were offered a final prayer, maybe a moment with a cleric. Sometimes your own slippers were taken off, a nod to the idea that you wouldn't need them where you were going. Kind of like checking your coat at the door, if the door led to your execution. Some rumors even claim the walls of that chamber were slightly padded not for comfort, but to muffle any final gasps or scuffles. Of course, historians still argue whether such a chamber truly existed or was a palace myth passed between terrified pages after dark. But then again, many things in Topkapi blurred the line between truth and legend. You trace a finger along the faded tilework, and for a moment, you swear you can feel the groove where someone once clawed it. Desperation leaves marks in the strangest places, but the cord always wins. Silk may be soft, but in Ottoman hands, it became the deadliest fabric of all. And then there's the unspoken etiquette of execution days. Sometimes, the condemned would be allowed to make a final request, usually a bowl of thick, sweet sherbet or a piece of fruit. Something simple. But other times, there was no time for dessert. Just a subtle nod, the flutter of a curtain, and a silence that echoed louder than any scream. You step back into the sunlight now, blinking. The warmth feels almost rude, after everything you've just seen in your mind's eye. But welcome to the Ottoman court. 1 part paradise, 1 part purgatory. And you've only just opened the first velvet door. You move deeper into the palace, your footsteps now guiding you past a hall lined with towering portraits of long-dead sultans. Their eyes seem to follow you, all mustaches, turbans, and barely concealed menace. Each ruled with a hand that cradled poetry and punishment in equal measure. You pause at one painting, Salem, the Grim, his name not exactly a confidence booster. Legend says he once had 7 grand viziers executed in a single year. That's roughly 1 per month. And let's be honest, your current boss might be a nightmare, but at least your HR meetings don't end with silk around your neck. As your gaze drifts down the corridor, you're drawn to a room that looks less opulent and more functional. It has a low ceiling, thick walls, and no windows, a place that feels like it's trying very hard to forget something. Inside, a pedestal stands at the center, worn smooth by time and possibly by a great deal of squirming. This is where things got personal. If the first chapter of your punishment was court intrigue and polite strangulation, the next involved far less subtlety. Welcome to the art of making a political problem disappear with a splash. You hear it before you see it, the slow, rhythmic churn of water. Through an archway at the edge of the garden lies the Bosphorus, that shimmering ribbon of sea that slices Istanbul in half like a silver dagger. And on its edge, a small dock. Simple, unadorned, and notorious. This is where royal brothers, sometimes newborns, sometimes just barely walking toddlers, met a tragic fate, tucked inside a sack and quietly slipped into the current. The Ottomans called it kafes siyaseti, or the cage policy, though that term became better known later. But early on, things were less subtle. Succession in the Ottoman Empire wasn't a game of oldest son wins. It was more of a deadly foot race where everyone with a royal bloodline was a potential threat. So, if your brother became sultan, well, maybe don't unpack just yet. Here's the part that makes your stomach turn. They used sacks. Sturdy, coarse cloth bags. Nothing decorative. They'd place the unfortunate sibling inside, sometimes with stones, to ensure a quicker descent. A mute executioner, always mute, always loyal, would then carry the bundle to the dock and gently, almost lovingly, tip it into the sea. No public spectacle, no last rites, just a ripple in the water, and silence. Historians still argue whether this policy was a grim necessity or pure cruelty. Was it better, they wonder, than prolonged civil wars, than bloody coups and endless rebellions? After all, European monarchs often resorted to brutal open warfare among sibling saxes, gallows, poison, and goblets. The Ottomans simply streamlined the process, made it efficient, quiet. Of course, not every prince got the sack. Later reforms softened the process, favoring life imprisonment in luxurious yet mentally ruinous apartments known as the cage. But that's another corridor, another night. For now, you stand by the water's edge, the waves lapping gently at the stone steps, and imagine the countless lives erased right here. It's hard to reconcile this with the empire's love for poetry and calligraphy. One minute, a young boy is playing with marbles in the garden. The next, he's weighed down with stones and forgotten by breakfast. It's said, the palace servants knew how to tell when such a night was coming. The scent of sandalwood burned stronger, orders arrived with fewer words. A certain eunuch would walk the corridors with eyes lowered, hands clasped tightly. Some say the mother of the condemned would know it too not from any official decree, but from how the wind shifted or how the birds outside her window refused to sing. The Ottomans had mastered subtle dread. Now, just in case your dreams weren't already headed for a dark turn, let's add a fringe tidbit. Some records claim that the executioners in charge of these sack drownings were paid per body. Yes, like Uber drivers, but with less chatting and more aquatic regicide. The more sacks delivered, the higher the bonus. Try adding that to your LinkedIn skills. But let's not get too bogged down in the water. You turn away from the dock, retracing your steps through the gardens. The birds are chirping again, almost too cheerfully. You pass a small fountain, its basin wide and shallow, filled with water lilies and the occasional dragonfly, and right next to it, a bench, ornate, marble, cold, and possibly used for other purposes. This very bench, some say, was where the condemned were made to kneel before being strangled or worse. There's no plaque, of course, just a crack down the center and a stain the weather never quite washed out. You duck through a narrow passage now, past a series of heavy wooden doors, and find yourself in one of the lesser-known wings of Topkapi. It's darker here, less restored, and blessedly lacking in tourist signs. A stone staircase leads downward. You hesitate. The air grows cooler with each step, and the lanterns seem to flicker just a bit more nervously. At the bottom, you reach a chamber that smells faintly of damp wool and regret. The walls are thick and sweat-stained, the floor sloped slightly toward a drain. You don't want to know why. Here, they didn't use sacks. Here, punishments were carried out more directly. No silk cords. Just ropes, clubs, maybe a dagger or two. This room, some believe, was reserved for traitors, courtiers who schemed too boldly, servants who listened at the wrong door, lovers who didn't keep secrets. But there's no grandeur here, no ceremony, just cold practicality. You imagine one of those silent executioners again, not with a bowstring this time, but a rough rope fraying at the ends. Maybe he's alone. Maybe there's two of them, working in practiced rhythm. Either way, The room holds the kind of memory that seeps into the stone. Some say the sultans never witnessed these punishments directly. Too unpleasant. But others argue that certain rulers, particularly the more paranoid one, insisted on seeing the moment the threat was eliminated. They'd watch from a lattice window or behind a curtain, their face unreadable as the final act unfolded. It's a lonely thing, ruling an empire that vast. Sometimes, maybe, the only thing you can truly control is how the people closest to you die. And yet, for all this brutality, the Ottomans saw themselves as just. They believed these punishments upheld divine order, preserved peace, protected the empire from chaos. It was never just about vengeance, it was about balance, an elegant sort of terror. And maybe, just maybe, it worked. For 600 years, the empire thrived. But if walls could talk, these ones would whisper of sacks and stranglers long before they spoke of sultans and scholars. You climb the stairs slowly now, each step heavier than the last. Above, the light returns, but it feels thinner somehow. The garden greets you again with its fountains and roses, but you don't hear the birds quite as clearly, just the faintest echo of water slapping against stone, and maybe the soft sigh of a silk cord tightening behind you. You walk the palace grounds like a ghost now, eyes catching on every rope looped casually around a column, every tile with a curious stain. The top copy is a masterpiece, no doubt, but masterpieces tend to collect shadows. And just when you think things couldn't get any worse than drowning children in sacks or royal strangulation with couture rope, you stumble into a courtyard that seems far too open, too sunny, too suspiciously cheerful. That's always a red flag. The wind carries a faint creak, not the usual pleasant groan of old wood in a breeze, but the dry whine of something vertical and terrible. You step closer and see it, a long polished stake rising from the ground, disturbingly well kept. It's not a flagpole number. It's far, far worse. And just like that, you've reached one of the Ottoman Empire's most gruesome, rarely discussed, and stomach-turning methods of punishment: impalement. Yes, you read that right. Impalement. The thing horror movies blur out, and museum exhibits politely gloss over with a euphemism like impactive punitive measures. But make no mistake, this was real, and it wasn't reserved for legends like Vlad the Impaler alone. The Ottomans, too, had their own versions of vertical vengeance. And standing here, with the sun glaring and the stake looming, you realize how dark the empire's justice system could truly go. Impalement wasn't just a method of killing, it was a message. It said, "This person messed with the Sultan, and we're not just going to kill him, we're going to make sure you think twice before you do anything remotely similar." The method varied. Sometimes, the stake entered through the abdomen. Sometimes, tragically, through lower, more vulnerable roots. Historians still argue whether these executions were performed by highly trained experts meant to prolong suffering without killing too quickly, or if it was simply chaos once the screaming started. Here's a quirky if horrifying tidbit. Some executioners were reportedly able to impale a person in such a way that the stake would avoid vital organs, allowing the condemned to remain alive sometimes for hours, even days. That's not just brutality, that's engineering. The victim would slowly slide down the stake under their own weight, the wood slick with sweat and worse, their moans fading into hoarse silence as the crows began to gather. You can almost hear the rustle of wings even now. The Ottomans used impalement sparingly, but deliberately. It was often reserved for traitors, rebels, or particularly defiant criminals. You didn't just get impaled for stealing figs or sneezing in the Sultan's direction. No, this was high theater punishment, meant for a crowd, meant to linger in memory. The stake would be placed at a crossroads or on a hill, somewhere public, somewhere visible for miles. And there the body would remain, slowly decomposing, like an anatomical warning sign. You glance around the courtyard, And imagine a crowd pressed together, eyes wide, mouths covered, children ushered away while soldiers stood in formation, backs straight, eyes forward. Somewhere nearby, a vendor still sold dates and flatbread. Life didn't stop for justice. It just ate lunch a little faster and avoided eye contact. And it wasn't always a solo performance. There are accounts of rows of stake show lines of condemned men, criminals and rebels skewered in a grotesque parody of offense. Some scholars argue these tales were exaggerated by European travelers, always eager to paint the Ottomans as monstrous. Others suggest those same scholars downplayed what they saw to avoid stirring diplomatic trouble. Either way, the truth remains unsettlingly slippery. But you want one more chilling detail? Some stakes were carved and sanded to minimize immediate internal damage. Not out of mercy, but for spectacle. A smoother stake meant less tearing, more control, a longer death. Think about the planning that went into that. Think about a carpenter, somewhere in the bowels of the palace, tasked with whittling the perfect stake, not too sharp, not too blunt. That's not the kind of job you brag about at dinner parties. You walk a little faster now, feet crunching over gravel. The sun's warmth feels oddly sinister against your skin. The top copy's beauty, once mesmerizing, now feels like a trick, a distraction, because beneath every rose bush lies a history of thorns, sharper than the blade of any executioner's sword. As you exit the courtyard, your mind replays the image. The stake, the silence, the crowd. But something else nags at you, a phrase from a scribe's memoir, scrawled in trembling calligraphy. To live without honor is to hang without weight. You don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds like the sort of thing a person tells themselves when they see a stake being prepared and start calculating how much time they have left. Further down the corridor, you spot a door small, discreet, half open. Inside is a cramped room with an old wooden chest, its hinges rusted and its surface scarred with burn marks. No one knows for certain what the chest once held, but rumor says it stored the tools of execution, cords, knives, maybe even stakes. Though frankly, that sounds a bit optimistic given the size. Still, the smell lingers, an odd mix of incense and iron. You don't stay long. Out in the garden again, the sky has changed. Clouds roll in over the Bosphorus, casting shadows over the marble. A chill breeze picks up, brushing the back of your neck like ghost fingers. You're not sure if it's the history, the air, or your imagination, but you quicken your pace. The palace is waking up in your mind, now not the tourist version, but the real one. The one where justice was beautiful and brutal, poetic and punishing. Where a whisper could mean death, and a glance could end your family line. And yet, the people lived. They prayed in the mosques, cooked eggplant stews, raised children. They composed poems, built libraries, discussed theology over cups of thick, sweet coffee. Life marched on, even under the shadow of the stake. Maybe that's the most astonishing part of all, not the brutality, but how ordinary people managed to carry on with it threaded through the fabric of everyday existence. Imagine hanging laundry while a warning corpse swayed nearby in the breeze. You pause one last time by the courtyard gate and glance over your shoulder. The stake is gone now, or maybe it was never really there, but the chill remains. The Ottomans may have vanished into history, their palaces turned into museums, and their executioners long since buried. But the feeling, this sense of beauty, laced with dread, lingers, like the echo of a scream muffled by silk. You turn a corner, boots scuffing against worn flagstones, and something odd happens. For a moment, you feel like you've left the palace altogether. The air thickens. The corridors narrow. Everything smells of iron, sweat, and something that might be lavender, an attempt, perhaps, to mask something else entirely. You're no longer in the realm of golden thrones and royal punishments. You've entered the world of bureaucrats, slaves, soldiers, and everyday wrongdoers. And it's here you discover that the Ottomans had a thing for silence, not just the kind that comes before a silk cord tightens, but a deeper, enforced silence. One that left people alive, if altered. Welcome to the twisted logic of bodily mutilation. No, not execution. This isn't about killing you. It's about taking something away so everyone else knows exactly what you did. A nose here, an ear there, a tongue snipped, pierced, or burned. You don't die, but you'll wish you had every time someone winces at your face or avoids your gaze on the street. Ottoman justice could be surgical when it wanted to be. And you? You're about to step through the threshold of one of its most notorious examples. The room is dim and cramped, the kind of place that seems to trap time. The smell hits first old poultice and scorched flesh. On the far wall, a narrow marble table leans under an arched window. It's not long enough for a full execution, but it's perfect for holding someone very still while something important is removed. A nose, for instance, or a tongue, or an eye. You might be tempted to ask, what kind of crime gets you this kind of punishment? And the answer is wonderfully varied. Gossip, treason, tax evasion, impiety, defaming a public official, or accidentally making the wrong joke about the Sultan's favorite concubine. The Ottomans believed that certain sins required visual reminders. If your words betrayed the empire, you lost your tongue. If your eyes wandered too freely into sacred places, you lost an eye. If your face became too recognizably traitorous, well, the nose was a nice centerpiece to target. One scribe records the case of a low-ranking court official who made a habit of eavesdropping and then passing along what he heard for a price. The punishment? Removal of both ears and branding on the forehead. He lived, yes, but with a face no one could look at without being reminded of what happened when you listened too well. Historians still argue whether these mutilations were more symbolic than widespread used, as rare examples to deter larger crimes. Some say they were theatrical, reserved for festivals of justice where entire towns turned out to witness the spectacle. Others insist they were common enough to be familiar, though perhaps not frequent enough to empty the barber shops. Either way, the cultural logic held, pain was private, but shame was public. But now comes the bizarre twist. Mutilation wasn't always a punishment. Sometimes, it was a career move. Take the court eunuchs. These weren't just random palace guards with fancy robes, they were powerful administrators, trusted confidants, even kingmakers. And they were made eunuchs, forcibly and permanently, often as children, castrated not just to eliminate lust, but to redirect loyalty. With no wives, no heirs, and no distractions, they were considered incorruptible, or at least too entangled in the palace to scheme beyond its walls. It wasn't just Ottomans who did this. Of course, many empires employed eunuchs, but the Ottomans elevated it to a refined institution. Eunuchs had uniforms. Eunuchs had titles. Eunuchs led armies of servants, managed the imperial harem, and whispered into the ears of sultans. You think your work commute is stressful? Try showing up for your first day, knowing you've already given up the right to father children in exchange for a lifetime of influence and the occasional death threat. The process itself was rarely spoken of in detail. Eunuchs came from conquered territories North Africa, the Balkans, the Caucasus. Boys, often captured or purchased, underwent the surgery en route to the palace, usually performed by desert traders or isolated monks. Very few survived. Those who did were seen as chosen, touched by fate, groomed for proximity to power. Their presence in the palace was a constant, quiet reminder. In the Ottoman world, transformation could be painful, but it could also mean promotion. You find yourself wondering how many of these silent men passed through the same halls you now walk, their shadows trailing long behind them. How many touched the same doors, the same curtains, the same scrolls written in calligraphy, so fine it almost hurts to look at it. But mutilation wasn't just about punishment or hierarchy. It was also about memory. A severed tongue stopped future lies. A missing nose ensured no one forgot your betrayal. Some criminals were even fitted with metal collars engraved with their Crimea portable biography of shame. And no, you couldn't take it off. If anything, it made you easier to spot in a crowd. You pass through another low door and find a courtyard framed by stone benches and towering plane trees. Birds chirp overhead. It should feel peaceful, but something lingers in the air. It's the sound of absence, the sound of voices that could no longer speak, eyes that could no longer see, hands that trembled with loss. You take a seat on the nearest bench and close your eyes. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickles, but underneath it, you hear another sound. Not real, of course. Just your imagination, layering history over reality. It's the sound of a man with no tongue trying to pray. And here's a final fringe detail for your evening torment. Some Ottoman cities had designated shame parades. People who had been mutilated were made to walk through the market streets, displaying their injuries like grotesque badges. Not always jeered at, sometimes pitied, sometimes feared, but never ignored. In a world where paper was precious and printing presses limited, the human body became a record book. One mutilated traitor was worth 100 pamphlets. Yet through all this, the empire marched forward. The bazaar reopened. The call to prayer echoed 5 times a day. The poet still wrote of roses and nightingales. It's the paradox of Ottoman life, a coexistence of beauty and barbarity. So intricate you could barely see the seams, and now you stand once more, brushing dust from your robes, and step back toward the heart of the palace. As the sun dips lower in the sky, the shadows stretch longer, like fingers reaching out from a darker time. You don't speak. You wouldn't dare. You've seen what happens to people who say the wrong thing here. You follow a long, echoing hallway now, lined with lanterns that flicker despite the absence of wind. Your footsteps fall in time with some ancient rhythm, a march you didn't mean to join. This corridor, unlike the others, leads outward away from the polished inner sanctum and into the spaces where order met enforcement. You pass a worn leather satchel on a hook, and next to it, hanging like an ominous afterthought, is a copper platter. Decorative? Not exactly. If the rumors are true, it once held heads. Yes, actual heads. Clean-shaven, perfumed, sometimes still warm. Because nothing said justice has been served in the Ottoman Empire quite like delivering a traitor's head on a dish, gift wrapped in rosewater-soaked gauze, and accompanied by a letter in the loveliest calligraphy you ever saw. That's the next room you're stepping into, where beheadings weren't just punishment, but presentation. And no, this wasn't a one-off theatrical stunt for the Sultan's birthday. Decapitation in the Ottoman system was a regular, ritualized procedure. The condemned would kneel in a mat if they were lucky, and the executioner, always well-trained, would swing with precision. 1 clean stroke if he was good. 2 if the condemned flinched. 3 if someone had skipped their training. The head, once removed, wasn't left to roll unceremoniously. It was lifted, placed, displayed, often in a copper basin or on a platter. The phrase, head on a platter, wasn't just a metaphor. Here it was an inventory item. You wander into a small courtyard off the main corridor, and it suddenly feels colder. There's a platform here, waist-high, with a groove carved into the stone for drainage. A narrow wooden railing borders the space, less for safety, more for containment. A place where justice was meted out while the court looked on with silent approval, or silent fear. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. And here's a historical fact that will settle unpleasantly in your brain. Under the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled with elegance, flair, and a passion for architecture, beheadings were surprisingly common. Suleiman, that refined patron of the arts, personally signed off on thousands of executions, including a few involving close friends, one former mentor, and yes, even his own son. So if your boss ever ignores your Slack messages, remember it could be worse. But it wasn't always political. Garden variety crimes, thievery, fraud, disrespect to a judge, could result in decapitation, especially if you were unlucky enough to be a repeat offender or the judge had skipped breakfast. Ottoman law combined religious Sharia with imperial decrees, and punishment varied wildly based on who you were, who you offended, and whether you'd made the Sultan's list that week. Let's not pretend this was done in secret either. Beheadings could be public affairs. In major cities like Istanbul or Edirne, they were sometimes carried out near the market, so vendors could pause their lentil sales to watch heads fall. You didn't just hear about justice, you witnessed it. One record describes a crowded square, where the executioner held up each head before the crowd, like a grotesque show and tell. Then the body was carted off or sometimes just left for a while to let the lesson sink in. Still not shuddering? Try this. There was a specific job title in the Ottoman Empire for the man who carried heads from the provinces back to the capital. Sort of a postal worker, meets grim reaper role. He'd arrive at the palace gates, hand over the head, and wait for payment. And if the head wasn't properly cleaned, dressed, or identifiable, he didn't get paid. Imagine the awkwardness of that performance review. Historians still argue whether these heads were embalmed, salted, or simply wrapped in cold cloth to keep them presentable. Some sources say they were kept overnight in cisterns to preserve them. Others insist they were paraded immediately. Decay, be damned. What's not debated is how seriously these deliveries were taken. The Sultan might study a traitor's face before making a decision about their family's fate. Wives, sons, brothers, they were all judged by the expression left on a dead man's brow. But let's swing back to the executioner. This wasn't some random burly guy in an apron. Ottoman executioners were a class of their own, known as Selit. They trained in secret. They had uniforms. They even had their own burial ground, an unmarked cemetery outside the city walls. No names, no gravestones, just mounds. The reasoning? No one wanted to remember them, but everyone needed them. It's said these men practiced their cuts on animals, first sheep, goats, and, if the rumors are to be believed, melon rinds balanced on stakes. Not exactly glamorous, but effective. Some became celebrities in their own dark way, whispered about, feared, bribed, avoided, and when they grew old, they retired to remote islands or border towns, where people didn't ask questions and kept their necks politely covered. You pass under a low arch now and find yourself in a shadowy alcove where a narrow table sits. On it, a dulled scimitar rests in a cradle of silk, too elegant to be a kitchen tool, too sinister to be ceremonial. The blade's edge is curved, designed not for stabbing but for sweeping. One motion. Final. You don't touch it. You just stare. And imagine the moment when it hovered in the air, held still for a heartbeat, before it came down and changed everything. Oddly enough, in some cases, the condemned were allowed to choose the day of their execution, a small mercy, or maybe just an illusion of control. Some would spend their final days composing poetry. Others fasted. One man, a Janissary commander accused of treason, reportedly spent his last hours sipping sweet coffee and humming a folk song about horses and rain. Here's a quirky fringe bit to lighten your heart just slightly. There were sometimes competitions among palace servants to guess whether the executioner would finish in one stroke or two. A grim betting game. Not exactly wholesome entertainment, but it was a way of coping, maybe even a way of pretending that death, when it's routine, becomes less real. You stand again, brushing imaginary dust from your sleeves, and step out into the twilight. The air feels thinner, your heartbeat steadier, oddly enough, like your body knows it has survived something it didn't fully experience. Above you, the clouds begin to clear, revealing slivers of moonlight on domes and minarets, but you're not done walking. The next punishment waits just ahead, And it involves a garden. Yes, a garden. Because only in the Ottoman Empire could something so beautiful become so terrifying. You pass under another arched gate, and the smell of roses greets you thick, perfumed, almost cloying. It's a relief at first, until your eyes adjust to the strange little path you're on. Stone tiles line the way, flanked by neatly trimmed hedges, jasmine vines, and fountains that gurgle with lazy elegance. A nightingale sings from a fig tree, and somewhere, a gardener hums. You feel like you've wandered into a dream until you notice the marble plinths scattered throughout the garden. Empty pedestals, spaced just a little too far apart, each one bearing scratches and faint rust marks. These weren't made for sculpture. They were built for something else. Welcome to the Sultan's Garden of Tortures. It sounds like a bad theme park attraction, but this was very real. Set slightly apart from the main palace, complex close enough for the Sultan to enjoy a quiet stroll, but far enough to drown the occasional scream in the rustle of olive branches, this garden was where punishments were carried out with both artistry and detachment. The setting? Picturesque. The purpose? Anything but. You find yourself walking through one of history's cruelest contradictions. The execution ground disguised as a place of serenity. Here, punishments weren't just about ending life. They were about spectacle, slow unraveling, and sometimes poetic irony. The Sultan could recline beneath a cedar tree, sip sherbet, and order a man to be flayed just 10 paces away. There are records of musicians playing soft background music, while a vizier's feet were bastinadoed until his screams harmonized with the flute. It was said to be calming. For the Sultan, at least. Historians still argue whether the torture garden was a rotating tradition or a fixed location within Topkapi's ever-expanding grounds. Some claim it moved depending on the Sultan's mood or astrological leanings. Others insist it was nestled near the executioner's private quarters, hidden behind a false wall of vines and cypress. Either way, you're in it, and the birdsong has never sounded so sinister. One recorded punishment that took place here? The iron spike kneel. A large, sharpened iron peg was set into the ground, and the accused was forced to kneel on it while reciting verses from the Quran. If he made a mistake or if the Sultan thought the tone was off, stayed kneeling for hours. The irony was never subtle. You were expected to honor God while your knees slowly split open. Pain, with a spiritual garnish. Another particularly dreadful invention was the honey box. Picture this. A man accused of embezzlement is stripped to the waist, smeared with honey, and placed in a wooden crate with openings just large enough for his head and hands to stick out. The crate was left in the garden sun, near the fruit trees, where the bees, wasps, and ants were particularly active. It was meant to be a slow death days of torment before succumbing to stings, dehydration, or madness. Sometimes, the Sultan visited to check on the progress, occasionally dropping a sugared fig near the crate as encouragement. And let's not forget the musical punishments. One Janissary commander who insulted the court musicians was subjected to a full-day solo performance of dissonant string music, played inches from his ears. The strings were out of tune, the musicians were amateurs. The punishment? He couldn't cover his ears, not even blink too hard. It wasn't fatal, but it was unforgettable. He resigned 3 days later, then reportedly moved to a monastery in the mountains where birdsong was the only soundtrack. You pause now, at one of the empty plinths, and touch its surface. Smooth, cold, with tiny iron hooks embedded along the edge. Too symmetrical to be random, too specific to ignore. Someone was bound here, wrists pulled taut, ankles chained, maybe with perfumed garlands hung mockingly around their shoulders. The garden was beautiful. Yes, but its function was clear. Control through performance. Punishment as courtly theater. You can't help but recall that the Ottomans prized aesthetic harmony in everything: architecture, music, calligraphy. Why should violence be any different? Here, even the punishments had choreography. Executioners were taught to move fluidly, to display their craft with elegance. One account describes a man being caned with such rhythmic grace that onlookers reportedly compared it to a whirling dervish dance. If that sounds horrifying, that's because it was. But it was also normal. Here's the fringe detail for this walk in the floral abyss. Some believe that the garden doubled as a medicinal herb garden. Yes, that means that within arm's reach of the torture plinths grew lavender for calming, mint for digestion, and opium poppies for, well, obvious reasons. So while a courtier was having his fingernails pulled out one at a time, a physician might be plucking rosemary just 5 feet away. Talk about multitasking. And yet, life in the palace went on. As you walk deeper into the garden, the greenery thickens. You hear laughter from another wing, perhaps a child chasing a hoop down a colonnade. Someone nearby is playing the oud, its notes drifting lazily like smoke. In the distance, the muezzin calls for prayer. The empire continues steady, gilded, merciless. The Ottomans didn't see this as contradiction. They saw it as order. Everything had a place. The rose, the sword, the scroll, the scream. Harmony was not the absence of pain, it was pain properly placed. Just as the palace had a wing for worship and another for feasting, it had a wing for breaking. And in the garden of punishments, you didn't just die. You died artfully. You stepped past a marble basin, filled with rainwater and scattered petals, and for a moment, your reflection stares back. Pale, curious, maybe a little queasy. You wonder what crime you might have committed in this world. Not bowing deeply enough? Laughing too loudly? Sharing a joke about the Grand Vizier's nose? It wouldn't take much. And if you were unlucky, you'd be brought right here escorted by men in clean uniforms, your name already scratched into a ledger, your final words irrelevant. The roses would still bloom. And even now, centuries later, the flowers keep growing. You reach down and pluck one, just to smell it. It's beautiful, heavy with scent, soft, alive, and somehow, deeply wrong. The garden fades behind you, but its perfume clings. The scent of roses follows like a memory you can't shake, sticking to your clothes, your skin, even your thoughts. You make your way back toward the palace's interior chambers, past mosaic-tiled walkways and overgrown fig trees, and before long, you find yourself standing at the edge of a massive gate. Bronze, inlaid with mother-of-pearl and filigree so delicate it looks like lace. This is the gate of the black eunuchs, the guardians of the harem. And tonight, you're slipping into the most secretive wing of all. The harem isn't what pop culture told you it was. It wasn't just a boudoir full of languid women fanning themselves while waiting for the sultan's affections. It was a fortress of power, politics, ambition, and punishment. Every step you take past these doors echoes through a world of silken deception, whispered betrayals, and consequences sharper than any dagger. The scent here is rich attar of roses, burnt incense, and something else beneath it all. Something metallic. Like coins. Or blood. You pass under a carved wooden arch and find yourself in a long corridor. Walls painted with gold-edged flowers and birds. The illusion of paradise hiding what really went on here. Behind these doors were women dozens. Sometimes hundreds, ranging from concubines to legal wives to daughters of foreign rulers sent as diplomatic gifts, and each of them had secrets. In the harem, gossip was currency. A well-placed rumor could lift you to the sultan's arms, sir. Have you carted off in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. The punishments here were different. Less theatrical, more surgical. Poison was a popular option. Quiet, untraceable, often disguised in sweets, sherbets, or cups of coffee so thick they hid the shimmer of anything sinister. One concubine might have slipped something into her rival's pomegranate juice. Another might have whispered into a eunuch's ear and had a problem handled. Some women simply fell down staircases. Often. At least, that was the official story. Historians still argue whether the harem was truly as ruthless as the records suggest, or whether later accounts dramatized the intrigues to sell more books and scandalize European readers. But one thing's certain, life inside these chambers wasn't all silk and songbirds. If you wanted to survive, you needed sharp wits, quicker reflexes, and a stomach that could handle betrayal for breakfast. You pass a fountain, know its water perfectly still. Beside it sits a bench curved like a crescent moon. According to legend, a favorite concubine once sat there and dropped a single ring into the fountain's center. She said it would surface only when her rival's blood was spilled. That night, another woman was found collapsed in her quarters, mouth stained crimson with cherry juicer, something far less fruity. The next morning, the ring bobbed to the surface. And then there's the tale of the mirror room. You find yourself in it now, your reflection fractured across 1,000 glass panels. No corners, just light and angles. Some say this was where interrogations happened. Not loud, not bloody. Just a woman, a chair, and silence. A eunuch would ask a question. The woman would answer. Her reflection, multiplied infinitely, offered no escape from her own fear. If she lied, she might be taken to the quiet chamber. No one quite agrees what happened there. One theory involves scorpions. Another suggests a bed of glass. You're welcome to pick the version that'll haunt your dreams least. Speaking of eunuchs, let's talk about them. Again. But this time, the Khuzlar Sita chief black eunuch. He was the power broker of the harem, arguably more influential than many viziers. He controlled access to the sultan, managed correspondence, and handled problems. Quietly, efficiently. If you displeased the wrong person, you didn't get yelled at. You got reassigned, or reassigned to the afterlife. The chief eunuch didn't need to shout. He simply gestured, and a veiled servant delivered a tray with a sherbet that made your legs give out by the second sip. Not all punishments in the harem were fatal. Some were exquisitely psychological. A favored concubine might be demoted and forced to serve her replacement, washing her feet or arranging her pillows. Others were relocated to the mirrorless wing, where they were denied all Vanatino reflection, no cosmetics, no jewels. A slow erasure. Imagine being surrounded by gold and unable to see your own face. Imagine having once been kissed by the sultan and now being ignored by the staff who used to bow when you walked by. You peer into one of the side rooms, its door left slightly ajar. Inside, silk cushions, a low platform bed, and a gilded incense burner shaped like a phoenix. It's beautiful, hauntingly so, but something feels off. The cushions are undisturbed, no indentations. The bed doesn't look slept in. This was someone's room, and then it wasn't. Maybe she fell out of favor. Maybe she drank the wrong tea. Maybe she knew something no one wanted her to say aloud. Here, invisibility was a form of death. And here's your fringe fact of the night. Certain concubines, upon rising too high in favor, were given a personal taster nut to keep them safe, but to test their resolve. If you wouldn't eat first, someone else would. And if they died, well, consider it a promotion denied. These tasters, often mute slaves, rarely lived long. The harem had beauty. It had poetry. It had power plays. But what it lacked most was mercy. Still, there's no denying the brilliance of some of the women here. Kozum Sultan, for example, a concubine, then a queen mother, and finally a power broker who ruled the empire through her sons and grandsons. But even she wasn't immune. She died in this very harem, strangled with her own curtain cords by palace conspirators. Beautiful drapery by the waist still on display. Lovely tassels, potentially fatal. You pass through another corridor, this one lined with latticework windows. Moonlight spills through the wooden slats, dotting the floor with patterns. You pause to look out. Somewhere below, the palace guards pace slowly, oblivious to the quiet tension echoing through these rooms. You realize that for every feast, every musical recital, every painting of tulips and nightingales there, was a rival watched too closely, a servant who poured with trembling hands, a concubine who slept with a knife under her pillow. And still, the women here learned to survive. They practiced courtly arts. They played chess with real political consequences. They wrote poetry, embroidered riddles into their robes, and mastered the art of saying nothing when it mattered most. But if they failed, well, they became another shadow in a mirrored room, another ghost trailing perfume through empty corridors. You reach the end of the harem wing and push open a small wooden door. The scent shifts no longer rosewater and incense, but the dry, dusty smell of old stone and forgotten rooms. Behind you, the harem fades into silence. Ahead, even darker places await. But you've made it this far, and in the Ottoman Empire, that alone was an achievement. The door shuts behind you with a muted thud, the kind of closing sound that makes you instantly regret opening anything. You're back in the older layers of the palace now, the part that smells like damp stone, candle soot, and decisions that can't be undone. No more sunlight, just torch niches along the wall, flickering in a way that makes every shadow twitch. The hallway turns sharply, then narrows, and suddenly you're standing before a pair of squat wooden doors. They're carved with protective talismans and reinforced with bronze studs, but one look and you know exactly what's behind them. Welcome to the eunuch preparation chamber. Yes, that chamber. Don't squirm, we're going in. Now, take a moment to breathe. You're about to enter one of the most complicated, brutal, and bizarre institutions in Ottoman palace, life the making of a eunuch. The palace didn't just hire these men, they crafted them, transformed them, broke them down and rebuilt them into something useful, loyal, silent, and completely dependent on the system that mutilated them. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was policy. The Ottomans employed two major classes of eunuchs: black eunuchs usually from East Africa who guarded the harem, and white eunuchs usually from the Balkans or Caucasus who held administrative positions. The black eunuchs often rose higher, with the Kuzlar Ayasu, chief black eunuch, becoming one of the most powerful figures in the empire. But none of them started there. They started in this room. It's not much to look at plain stone walls, a shallow basin, a low wooden table. But it's what happened here that makes your blood crawl. Boys, sometimes as young as 8, were brought in, often as captives from wars or sold by desperate families. The operation? Let's just say it wasn't performed by board-certified surgeons. The full removal was done with a knife, a heated iron rod, and often nothing more than vinegar and prayers. If the boy survived the bleeding and infection, he was considered chosen. If he didn't, well, another would follow soon enough. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman palace doctors had refined techniques or whether survival was mostly luck and divine favor. Some records describe small teams of medical specialists who performed these surgeries in caravans across Africa before the boys even arrived in Istanbul. Others claim the procedure took place in secret palace rooms like this one, supervised by mute attendants trained in the grim art. Either way, the mortality rate was high, and yet the practice persisted for centuries. You kneel beside the low table. There's a groove cut into the wood, stained with something ancient. Beside it, a worn cloth, and what might have been a bite stick. No matter how poetic the empire tried to be, this was an act of raw, primal violence. A child laid down here, screaming into silence, his life forever divided into before and after. And yet some of these eunuchs rose to astounding heights. They became diplomats, scholars, treasurers. One even oversaw the construction of an entire wing of the palace. Another acted as regent for a child sultan, ruling from behind a veil of modesty and mutilation. They had no sons to inherit their power, so their loyalty stayed squarely within palace walls, in a system built on suspicion that made them ideal. But power didn't protect them from danger. Eunuchs were often the first to be blamed when things went wrong. Did a concubine fall ill? Must be the eunuch. Did a secret leak? Check the eunuch's quarters. Were two sultans suddenly at odds? Surely the eunuchs were stirring the pot. In truth, they probably were. They had access to everything. And when you're denied family and freedom, influence becomes your only currency. And here's your fringe detail for the night. Eunuchs had a private mosque within Topkapi Palace. A small, beautiful space open only to them where they prayed alone. No one else could enter. Not the sultan, not the viziers. It was theirs, and theirs alone. Imagine that a group of men who couldn't marry, couldn't father children, couldn't even be fully seen as men, yet they had a sacred space more exclusive than the imperial throne room. You rise now and leave the preparation room behind. But the thought lingers, show many voices were silenced before they even learned how to speak in courtly whispers. How many were considered lucky just for waking up after surgery? You pass a hallway where robes hang on iron hooks. Some of them are trimmed in gold formal uniforms, likely worn by senior eunuchs on ceremonial days. You reach out to touch one, and the fabric is stiff, beautiful, lifeless. Back in the brighter parts of the palace, tourists today stroll through these halls snapping selfies, but none of them see this room. It's kept behind closed doors, sometimes deliberately left off maps, because even empires with glorious calligraphy and stunning ceramics have parts they prefer to forget. You follow the corridor as it curves, leading you into the residential quarters for high-ranking eunuchs. It's quiet here, peaceful, even. Small but elegant rooms with writing desks, prayer mats, and low couches. These men were more than functionaries. They were scholars, administrators, advisors. They understood the currents of court life better than anyone. And yet, their lives began in a scream and a blade. There's a story about a eunuch who saved the empire twice. Once, by intercepting a plot in the harem. Another time, by smuggling an heir out of the palace during a coup attempt. His name? Lost to history. No tombstone, no portrait. Just a single sentence in a forgotten ledger. He prevented a fire from spreading. That's it. That's his reward. You pass a shrine tiny, tucked into a corner with a single flickering candle and a carved wooden box for offerings. A few coins have been left behind. Some by visitors. Some, perhaps, by descendants of palace workers who still whisper prayers for the souls of those who served silently. You add a coin, not because you have to, but because silence deserves remembering too. And then, as you move back toward the main wing of the palace, a gust of wind sweeps through the corridor. It smells of clove, salt, and old paper, a blend of the empire's scent, of history, of pain, of poetry written with ink and blood. You step back into the torchlight, the walls around you humming with secrets too old to scream anymore. Behind you, the preparation chamber waits. Quiet, patient. Like the empire itself, it doesn't need to chase you. It knows you'll remember it. You emerge from the dim hallways of the eunuch's quarters into a softer, space-cooler air. Golden afternoon light slanting in through latticed windows, and the faint scent of rose oil and cinnamon. The mood shifts. You're in the harem again, but not the guarded corridors or the reflective dread of punishment chambers. This part of the palace feels almost cozy. Almost. Because while the cushions are plush and the fountains are delicate, this is where palace drama reached operatic levels. This is where rivalries simmered under the surface of silk, where affection was currency, and where vengeance was sometimes served with sugared almonds and wine-soaked apricots. Tonight, you're diving into the dangers of harem life, and the consequences that followed when decorum shattered like porcelain on marble. In a place built for beauty, jealousy was always just one polished step away from poison. The Ottoman harem was a paradox, a prison gilded in velvet. For some women, it meant upward mobility. For others, lifelong confinement. But no one was safe, especially not from each other. Hundreds of women, often taken from conquered lands or gifted by provincial governors, lived under one roof. Some were trained as dancers or musicians. Others were assigned menial tasks. But the ultimate goal? Rise in rank, catch the Sultan's attention, bear a child, and hopefully survive. In this setting, ambition didn't just bloom, it grew fangs. When one concubine received the Sultan's favor, others took notice. A glance in the baths, a murmured prayer overheard, a missing ring, these could all be signs, or omens, or the prelude to something darker. Because within this palace of whispering silks and censored sighs, crimes weren't always bloody, but they were deadly. One favored method of harem vengeance? Poison. Elegant, efficient, and most importantly deniable. Many women had personal attendants or food tasters, but clever rivals found creative workarounds. One infamous case involved a honeyed fig stuffed with crushed glass, delivered as a peace offering after a public argument. The recipient took a single bite, smiled politely, then collapsed into her attendant's arms before she could finish the second. That incident is said to have prompted stricter food inspections for high-ranking concubines, and a quiet promotion for the gift giver. Historians still argue whether poisonings were as widespread as legends claim, or if the stories were inflated by Western travelers hungry for scandal. But even the skeptics admit there were too many sudden illnesses, too many mysterious fevers, too many accidents in the baths, to chalk up to coincidence. Even in the most controlled corner of the Ottoman world, nature rarely slipped that often on wet tiles. Of course, not all punishments within the harem came from personal vendettas. Some were ordered from above quietly, diplomatically. When a concubine stepped out of line, the consequences didn't always involve death, but they did involve exile, or silence, or shame. There was the cooling room, a windowless, echoing chamber where troublesome women were sent to reflect. No mirrors, no conversation, just damp air and silence. Some were left there for hours. Others, days. It was said to be more effective than a beating. Then there was the Night of Veils. This wasn't a festival, but a punishment. A woman accused of seduction, betrayal, or theft might be forced to dress in full bridal attirails, jewels. The whole charadian paraded silently through the corridors, past the very concubines she'd once shared jokes with. At the end of the procession, she was delivered not to a bed, but to a quiet room at the palace edge, where her fate would be decided. Banishment, forced religious devotion, or death. The performance wasn't for her, it was for everyone watching. You step into one of the harem dormitories now, your shoes muffled against layered carpets. Everything is lovely. And that's what makes it worse. Carved headboards, silk cushions, polished mirrorless luxury, curated for control. You can almost hear the laughter that once filled this room, followed by sudden silence when a eunuch entered with a sealed letter. Maybe it contained an invitation to the Sultan's private chamber. Maybe it was a summons to the punishment room. The only certainty? You wouldn't sleep well afterward. You pause at a writing desk in the corner, where a delicate calligraphy set rests still, ink-stained, despite the decades. Women here were educated. They wrote poetry, histories, letters. Some even kept secret diaries, hidden in false bottom drawers or sewn into mattress linings. One famous concubine, rumored to be Greek, kept a running tally of her perceived enemies. When the palace was raided after a succession crisis, her list was found complete with notes like, "snores like a goat," and "cries too much to be trusted." Honest? Yes. Dangerous? Also yes. And for the most part, these women couldn't leave, not unless they were married off to favored officials or sent to religious institutions. If they bore a son, they could climb the ranks, becoming a sultan's mother, Valide Sultan, and wielding terrifying influence. But the stakes were high, because if their son died or fell from grace, they too could be cast out. One day you're sipping rose tea beneath a carved wooden ceiling. The next, you're shivering in a crumbling seaside villa, forgotten. And here's your strange tidbit for the night. Some concubines practiced folk magic. Quiet spells muttered into bowls of water. Small wax figures hidden in braziers. Hair braided with protective charms. Technically forbidden, but tolerated if it didn't interfere with palace harmony. One record tells of a woman caught burning the names of her rivals scratched into silk. She claimed it was just poetry. She was relocated to the library wing and never seen again. You step into a narrow room now, probably a bathing space where the tiles glisten with old polish. The domed ceiling above is pierced with glass stars that let in the moonlight. It's beautiful, and echoing with past arguments. This is where fights happened. Elbows thrown beneath the rose-scented steam. Slaps muffled in the wet. Some say the guards didn't always intervene. Sometimes they just watched. If things got too violent, someone might slip, or be helped to slip, and with wet marble, no one could say for sure. Still, it wasn't all fear. Many women found sisterhood, even love, in the harem. They played music together, embroidered stories into linens, composed whispered lullabies that reached the ears of future sultans. Some rivalries cooled, others simmered for decades, only to be avenged with a smirk at the dinner table. The harem wasn't just a cage, it was a world. Its own politics, its own codes, its own quiet punishments, wrapped in perfume and silk thread. You step out of the bathing chamber into the courtyard again. The moon is higher now, silvering the fountains. Somewhere, a flute plays a melody that's half lullaby, half funeral dirge. You realize you've spent the entire evening walking in circles through a palace designed to make you feel watched, judged, and replaceable. And just when you think you've heard the worst of its strangulation, exile, poison, you remember one final punishment, reserved for the most treacherous, sewn into a sack like the royal brothers and tossed into the Bosphorus. No headlines, no tombstone, just bubbles and silence. You adjust your robe and keep walking. The harem is behind you now, but the scent of rose oil still clings. And the feeling that someone's watching you, that stays too. You take a right turn at a hallway draped with beaded curtains, their soft clatter brushing behind you like a warning you can't quite translate. The light dims again, not from nightfall, but from architecture. The Ottomans knew how to build shadows into their walls. The ceilings lower, the air thickens, the stone grows colder. You descend a narrow stairwell carved into the very bones of the palace, its steps gently worn by centuries of uneasy pacing. And when you emerge at the bottom, you find yourself in a place far removed from music, gardens, and even executions. This isn't death. This is something worse. This is waiting. Welcome to the cafes, the golden cage, a paradox of punishment where luxury met isolation, and survival came at the cost of sanity. This was where Ottoman princes, those unlucky enough to be born too royal, were locked away for years, sometimes decades, in gilded apartments sealed off from the world. Not dead, not free, just paused. Like an empire, unsure what to do with its future. The room you're in now looks deceptively gentle. The walls are painted in soft pastel blues and pale golds. The windows are latticed, letting in light but denying any view. The carpets are lush, the furniture ornate. There are books here, musical instruments. Even caged songbirds' metaphors on loan from the decor department. But don't be fooled. This was one of the most psychologically destructive punishments in Ottoman history. It wasn't loud, It didn't bleed, but it lasted. Historians still argue whether the cage was an act of mercy or madness. Before it existed, royal succession often involved fratricide brothers murdering brothers in bloody purges to ensure an uncontested throne. So the kafus was a solution of sorts. Instead of execution, heirs deemed a threat were confined to this part of the palace. Out of sight, technically alive, but never permitted to engage in politics, hold power, or even walk the gardens freely. It was house arrest with peacocks. Imagine being a prince born with armies in your name, taught the Quran by the best tutors, trained in the art of war and diplomacy, then one day, told you would never leave this room, not for a week, not for a season, for the rest of your life. Maybe you'd see the Sultan once a year, across a screen. Maybe you'd be allowed visitors, as long as they didn't speak too loudly or bring news of the outside world. But mostly, you'd sit and wait, and forget what freedom tasted like. Some princes adapted. They read endlessly, composed music, tended to miniature gardens in ceramic pots. One even became obsessed with carving ships out of dried melon seeds. Another kept an imaginary zoo, naming cracks in the floor after animals he remembered from childhood. Some managed to maintain their composure for decades, others not so much. There's one prince, in particular, whose name palace historians whisper like a cautionary tale. Let's call him the poet. He spent 27 years in the cage, entered as a teenager, exited with a beard and eyes that refused to meet anyone's dace prosence. During his time inside, he wrote a 600-page epic poem. No one knows what happened to it. When he finally emerged as sultan, no Lesh ruled for exactly 93 days before being overthrown. His first decree, a new garden of tulips. His second, a ban on mirrors, fringe, detail time. There were actual cages within the cage, wooden lattices built within rooms to create even smaller enclosures. Sometimes they were symbolic, sometimes not. There are records never officially confirmed of princes being kept inside literal caged-off corners of their already locked rooms, only let out for meals or supervised walks around the interior courtyard. A prison inside a prison, lined with gold leaf and embroidered pillows. But let's not pretend the cage was just about seclusion. It was surveillance, too. The princes weren't alone, they were watched. Mute servants monitored their every move. Food was prepared elsewhere and brought in by heavily vetted staff. Letters were inspected. Dreams were quietly discouraged. And sometimes, if a prince spoke too freely or hinted at ambition, he would find his books removed, his ink gone dry, his companions reassigned. Punishment here wasn't about pain, it was about erosion. You walk to one of the tall windows now. It's covered with a wooden screen, intricately carved in floral motifs, beautiful and utterly opaque. You can hear the courtyard beyond footsteps, a bird, the faint chime of a servant's bell, but you can't see a thing. And if you were a prince locked in here, this would be your world. Hearing laughter you'll never join. Smelling feasts you'll never taste. Feeling seasons shift only by the breeze that occasionally snuck through the screen's tiny holes. There's an inkwell on the nearby desk. Dried. Dusty. The parchment beside it has only one word, half finished. It looks like a name, or maybe the start of a prayer. You wonder how many times these men began to write something and stopped because it wouldn't be read, or it wouldn't be safe, or because they simply forgot what they wanted to say. And then there's the worst part. Hope. Because some princes were released. If a brother died, or the throne became unstable, the cage could open. But by then, the damage was often done. Men who hadn't seen sunlight in decades, who hadn't spoken to anyone but mute guards, were suddenly expected to lead an empire. And they did, often badly. Ottoman decline, some scholars argue, was accelerated by these damaged rulers' products of silk-lined solitude who knew how to survive isolation, but not how to govern. You pass through another room larger, emptier. It might have been used for prayer or music or pacing. A single mat lies in the corner, worn to threads. The walls are covered in faint linoscores from counting days, or tallying verses, or simply trying to prove that something here was real. The silence presses in. You start to understand why this place unraveled so many minds. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it just doesn't end. And here's a detail that might unsettle you more than the rest. The cafes wasn't officially abolished until the 19th century. That means, while Europe built steam engines and debated constitutional monarchies, Ottoman princes were still being quietly padded into these rooms. Still waiting. Still watching shadows crawl across the floor and wondering which one was theirs. You head back up the stairs now, one step at a time, the weight of invisible years pressing against your spine. At the top, the door swings shut behind you with an audible click, and you're free. At least, for now. But in the corner of your eye, you still see that latticed window, still hear the soft scraping of a prince pacing across tile, still feel the breathless hush of a palace that knows exactly how to keep its problems quiet. The garden air feels a little less fresh now, the sound of fountains more like static. You survived the cage, but you're not sure you came out entirely whole. You step out into a cloistered courtyard where the shadows are sharp, the light pale, and the air carries that crisp, uncanny stillness that only happens when history refuses to exhale. There's a row of drying lines harrow-rope strung between carved stone pillars, flapping with what seem like old linens. But look closer. The shapes are wrong, the seams too deliberate, the edges too human. Welcome to the part of the story that should never be bedtime material. And yet, here you are, with your feet planted in a place where skin once hung like parchment. Yes, this is where we talk about flaying. Not metaphorically. Not as a phrase for gossip or betrayal. We're talking literal, blade-to-flesh flaying. In the Ottoman Empire, it was rare. But it happened. And when it did, it was not just punishment, it was performance, terror, and message, all rolled into one. Because sometimes, to make someone truly disappear, you had to turn them into a lesson. You move along the courtyard, careful not to touch anything. On the far wall, there are rust-colored stains weathered by rain, blurred by time, but unmistakable. This wasn't where they killed people. This was where they displayed what was left. The flaying itself usually happened elsewhere, in specially prepared rooms, with drainage channels carved directly into the floors. Efficient. Sanitary, by imperial standards. But once the work was done, the skin tanned, stretched, and in some cases, reportedly marked with ink would be hung here to dry. Not out of cruelty alone, out of purpose. Who got flayed, you ask? Traitors of the highest caliber, assassins caught in the act, spies discovered after infiltrating the inner court. This wasn't your average thief or gossipy concubine. This was reserved for the kind of betrayal that made the Sultan's pen tremble on the page. And the punishment? It had to match the magnitude. Something unforgettable. Something permanent. There's a story half documented, half legend about a court physician who attempted to poison the Sultan's coffee. He was caught, of course. The eunuchs noticed the scent was off. Too bitter. Too slow to rise. The physician confessed, after a brief encounter with the royal interrogators, and was sentenced not just to death, but to erasure. They flayed him from the shoulders down, preserved the skin, and hung it here for 7 days. On the 8th, it vanished. Some say it was burned. Others say it was folded into a book, because yesher comes your fringe fact of the night. There were rumors, unconfirmed but persistent, that certain palace tomes were bound in the skins of traitors. No catalog entries, no index, just ink and gilt. Historians still argue whether these stories are real or the fevered dreams of terrified servants writing memoirs under candlelight. Some accounts say the practice was borrowed from the Persians, others claim it was imported from Roman traditions. But one thing is clear: the Ottomans had little interest in half measures when it came to betrayal, and sometimes silk ropes and honeyed figs just didn't send the right message. You step into one of the adjacent rooms: low ceiling, stone floor, a smell of vinegar and something else you can't place. The basin in the corner is stained. The grooves on the table are shallow, but deep enough to catch your eye. It's quiet, too quiet. You imagine the executioners here not loud, not cruel, just methodical. Professionals with gloves of horsehide and knives honed to whisper-thin edges. They didn't work quickly. That wasn't the point. The condemned was often given opium first, not out of mercy, but to keep them still. If they died before the skin was fully removed, the punishment failed. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to strip away identity, status, name, everything. You find a small niche in the wall with scrolls stacked vertically. Most are tax records. One, oddly, is labeled only with a date and a sigil. You're tempted to open it, but maybe don't knock. Some pages aren't meant to be turned before sleep, and it wasn't just humans who were flayed. Sometimes banners were made from flayed skins of war horses killed in failed charges, stretched and dyed and used in processions as grim warnings. You'd think someone would have objected, but again, this was an empire built on contrasts, faith and brutality, roses and bones. You wander back out into the light, blinking. The courtyard now seems too clean, too white, too forgiving. Maybe the stains are gone, maybe they never were. You hear the call to prayer echoing through the stone arches above, soft and solemn. It reminds you that even the darkest punishments unfolded under a canopy of sacred rhythms. The Sultan might sip his coffee in the garden while a man's name was being erased behind the walls. And both moments felt equally real. And if you're wondering, yes, the skin was sometimes labeled. Small calligraphy inscriptions were supposedly placed near the drying racks, noting who the person was, what their crime had been, and who had ordered the sentence, like a museum placard. But more, final. Later, when visitors from Venice or France passed through the palace on diplomatic missions, they never saw this part. No one offered a tour of the punishment wing. They saw the tulips, the tiles, the intricate clockwork fountains, the empire's polished face. But this was hidden, or half hidden, or sometimes revealed just enough to make them squirm. Because diplomacy is always easier when the guest feels just a little bit fragile. You walk once more beneath a trellis of blooming jasmine. It's beautiful, disarmingly so. And that's the cruelest part. The Ottomans understood how to pair elegance with horror. The most terrifying acts didn't happen in dungeons. They happened in daylight, in courtyards, in gardens, under carved ceilings and beneath painted stars. The empire didn't need shadows to make you afraid. It used light. You stop beside one final pedestal, a slab of marble with no inscriptions. Just a groove at the top, barely deep enough to hold a basin. It's dry now, but the air above it feels heavier. You step back. No need to stay too long here. Your presence has been noted. As you leave, you feel your shoulders lighten slightly, as if the walls have released their grip. But the memory remains. Of linen that wasn't linen. Of pages that might whisper when no one's listening. Of justice, not blind, but exquisitely focused. And just a little too creative. You move away from the courtyard of flayed ghosts, up a stairwell that curves like a question mark, only to arrive in a chamber that somehow feels both open and claustrophobic at once. The windows are wide, but the air doesn't move. It's warm, thick with incense, and on the far wall hangs a long bronze mirror too tall for vanity, too heavy for anything except ceremony. You're in a reception room now. the kind where petty officials and disgraced nobles once made their final appeal to the powers that be. But beneath the surface diplomacy, something darker lingered, because when flaying was too much and strangling too polite, the Ottomans had another form of punishment that struck directly at the soul: disfigurement. Tonight, you learn how losing a nose could save your life, or ruin it forever. The Ottoman Empire, like many great powers, placed tremendous value on appearance, especially in the court. To look whole, clean, well-formed, and symmetrical was to be taken seriously. Scars were stories. But missing pieces? Those were sentences. A man with no nose or ear was more than just unfortunate he was marked. A living cautionary tale. And the beauty of it, from the state's perspective, was that you could keep such people alive, parading their regret through the streets with every blink. You approach a low wooden bench in the center of the room. The grain is worn smooth by nervous hands. This was the bench of judgment. Here, scribes would kneel, messengers would deliver bad news, or tax collectors would confess shortfalls. Some left with a slap on the wrist, others left missing parts of their face. Nose cutting was particularly common. It was used to punish adultery, treachery, or betrayal in diplomatic affairs. Sometimes even embezzlement earned you the snip, and it wasn't always done in private. Quite the opposite. One account tells of a scribe caught altering correspondence to the Sultan. He was brought into this very room, his crime read aloud, and then before the gathered officials a thin-bladed knife was drawn from a red silk pouch. His nose was sliced off with one clean motion, cauterized with hot iron, and he was handed a small linen cloth for the blood. Then, he was sent back to work. Yeshi kept his job. That was part of the punishment, because now, every time someone saw his face, they remembered what happened to liars. Historians still debate whether this policy was widespread or reserved for symbolic cases. Some argue that it became more common in times of imperial paranoia, when sultans feared plots and wanted reminders of loyalty displayed like living banners. Others say the practice was regional, more prevalent in border provinces where civil order needed a visible deterrent. Either way, you can bet there weren't many people cutting corners on tax reports when their predecessor had a bandaged face and a tremor in his voice. The effect wasn't just visual. The social weight of disfigurement was enormous. A missing nose or ear often led to exile from city centers. Some were forbidden from entering mosques or marketplaces, seen as impure or unlucky. And yet, they were not entirely cast out. No, they served a purpose as warnings, living monuments to poor decisions. The empire didn't need to build statues. It had walking billboards. And then there's the poetic irony of it all. In a culture that revered beauty-ornate dress, elaborate poetry, gilded calligraphy, deliberate marring of a body became a kind of unwriting. You weren't just punished. You were revised, like a sentence scratched out on parchment. There's a particularly grim tale of a vizier's clerk who insulted a high-ranking janissary captain. The offense: a joke, ill-timed, poorly received, and whispered during a festival. The captain laughed in the moment, then had the man summoned 3 days later. No trial, just a brief explanation and a ceremonial branding iron heated in front of the court. The clerk's ear was sliced in half, then the brand applied, leaving a burn mark in the shape of a tulip. From then on, he was known as the tulip-eared one. He never told another joke. You walk through a small door beside the main chamber and find yourself in a narrow hallway filled with painted portraits, not sultans this time, but statesmen, officials, their faces carved in profile. Curiously, some appear edited, noses blurred or stylized, ears concealed behind collars. You wonder how many of these men were disfigured in life and restored in paint. A mercy of the brush. Or a lie. Probably both. And now, for your fringe fact. Some Ottomans, who were disfigured, sought restorative reputation. It was a term used in court records, referring to the process of redeeming one's name through heroic acts. A former tax official, noseless from a fraud conviction, once helped stop an arsonist from burning down a neighborhood hammam. In return, the local governor issued a decree permitting the man to walk the streets uncovered, his punishment acknowledged, his repentance honored. A public version of the medieval "he did a bad thing, but we're cool now." Others, less lucky, were exiled to distant provinces, where they were given small tasks watching border crossings, tending to salt pans, or managing caravanserais far from the capital. The message was clear. You're still useful, just not where anyone can see you too closely. You pass a brass mirror mounted low on a hallway pillar, angled so that one must bend down to see into it. In its reflection, the room behind you seems to shimmer slightly. You try to imagine your face without a nose, or with one ear gone. Not from battle or accident, but from sentence. The difference is everything. One is honorable. The other, a lifetime of curious glances, avoided conversations, and questions answered with silence. It wasn't just men. Some women were disfigured too, usually in private, usually quietly. A concubine caught poisoning another might be punished with a scarred cheek or a branded shoulder. Not enough to ruin her beauty entirely, just enough to remind everyone who saw her bathing what she'd once attempted. These scars were maps. They spoke in the language of omission and rumor. You pause at the end of the hallway where a small plaque rests beneath an oil lamp. It reads simply, "Justice is both written and worn. That's not metaphor. That's imperial policy." You step back into the main chamber, and the heavy air seems to ease just slightly. The room has said what it needed to say. You've seen how the Ottomans rewrote people without ink, how they turned skin into ledger and scar into footnote. As you move away, the light outside has shifted. You catch a glimpse of the Bosphorus through a lattice window, its surface smooth and silvery. Beautiful, reflective, but you can't help but wonder how many secrets it hides beneath. The corridor you now follow curves downward, spiraling like a conch shell into the earth. The air thickens with humidity, and each step sounds softer than the last does if the palace itself is gently muffling your approach. The walls shift from marble to something darker, something closer to limestone, and overhead, a dripping sound begins to echo faintly. You're not in the harem anymore. You're not even in the courtly wings. You've entered the realm of storage, kitchens, and punishment pits. And this one? It smells like sugar, which is strange until you realize you're standing in front of the molasses room. Yes, molasses. And no, you're not here for a snack. You've arrived at one of the more bizarre punishment methods recorded in Ottoman history: execution by boiling. And in some cases, not with oil, but with thick, bubbling molasses. You didn't mishear. Someone actually stood in a room and said, "Let's cook him slowly, in syrup." You pause at the threshold. The door before you is iron-braced wood, warped from centuries of steam. There's a narrow grate in the floor for draining, probably more symbolic than effective, and along one wall sits a great copper cauldron, blackened underneath from long-dead fires. Its surface glistens faintly, and you find yourself both fascinated and horrified. This wasn't just a kitchen, it was a crucible. So why molasses? That's what everyone asks. Boiling in oil was gruesome, yes, but understood. You cook food in oil. It's hot, it burns, it makes a gruesome sort of sense. But molasses? Thick, sticky, slow-moving? That's a different category. That's punishment with poetry. That's death by metaphor. And the Ottomans, never ones to skip an opportunity for symbolism, sometimes chose it to send a specific message. Your crimes are slow and clinging, so your end will be too. One of the most cited incidents involves a corrupt tax collector in the 17th century who had embezzled so much silver from the imperial treasury that the Sultan reportedly declared, "He has sweetened his pocket slit, his skin sweetened mine." The man was stripped, bound, and lowered by rope into a vat of molasses. Slowly, not submerged all at once, but dipped like a bitter fig into warm syrup. Whether the story is entirely true remains debated by scholars. But the rumor alone was enough to make lesser bureaucrats double-check their ledgers every night. Historians still argue whether these molasses punishments were truly carried out or existed as urban legend stools of psychological control rather than practical justice. One camp claims the death by syrup was symbolic, that the convicted man would be paraded through the market drenched in molasses, swarmed by bees and shame, until he either died of stings or collapsed in humiliation. Another theory suggests the practice originated in the palace kitchens, where thieves were caught stealing from stores of sugar and punished by immersion in hot syrup not to kill, but to scar, to teach. But there are darker records too, ones not open to the public, buried in private archives and estate inventories. These speak of full immersion, of wooden cranes installed in underground cookhouses, of skin sloughing from limbs like overripe fruit. One chronicler, writing anonymously, described the scent of burning sugar mixing with flesh, calling it the aroma of justice. You shiver. Your stomach, previously curious, now turns. Here's your fringe detail to sweeten or, rather, thicken the pot. Some believed molasses had purifying qualities. In small doses, it was used medicinally, even spiritually. So there was a twisted idea that death by molasses wasn't just a punishment, it was a kind of cleansing. Your body, corrupted by greed or betrayal, was boiled in something nourishing. Symbolic repentance, achieved through agony. You crouch beside the great cauldron now. The metal is cool, but the residue clinging to its sides still carries a faint tackiness. A worker's fingerprint, maybe, or something more permanent. The ladle hook still dangles above, creaking slightly in the humid air. You try not to imagine the moment when the condemned realized they weren't being taken to a cell or a courtyard, but to the kitchens. The moment the scent of sweet smoke told them exactly how things would end. You rise and move to the rear of the room, where a small wooden chest rests in a niche. Inside are copper bowls, now tarnished, and a pair of tongs long enough to reach the bottom of a deep pot. They weren't always used for cooking. Some punishments, according to records, involved spooning boiling syrup onto specific parts of the body, hands, feet, cheeks until skin blistered and burst. It wasn't a quick execution. It was a statement. You don't just punish a man. You display him slowly, painfully, like dessert, taking far too long to arrive. And here's the twist that somehow makes it worse. After certain syrup-based executions, the remains were buried not in paupers' fields, but in the royal gardens. Why? To fertilize the same earth that bore the empire's famed roses. You can't make this stuff up. Apparently, someone decided that returning a corrupted body to the soil via molasses made it more useful in death than in life. Again, never officially confirmed, but repeated just enough by scribes and whispers to make you wonder where the red of those roses really came from. You step out into the hallway again, the air now tasting faintly sweet, and not in a good way. Your boots stick ever so slightly to the floor with each step, and your mind runs a little slower, as if weighted down by syrupy dread. You've seen a lot by now: strangulation, flaying, silent cages, but somehow, this feels more intimate, more perverse. The idea of turning justice into a dessert. As you make your way toward the stairwell, the sounds of the palace return barely. A servant humming, a pigeon cooing in the rafters, the scrape of distant slippers on tile. But you're not quite ready to rejoin the world yet. You pause beside a narrow doorway where a single oil lamp burns in a glass case. It's said to have been lit in memory of the molasses victims, though no nameplates exist. Just the flame, flickering over a copper bowl once used to carry justice, one ladle at a time. You watch it for a moment, the light warping across the walls, and then you continue upward. With each step, the air grows cooler, lighter. But even as you breathe fresh palace air again, your senses remain syrup-warped, because now you know what happened when sweetness went bitter in the Ottoman court. And you're not done yet. The empire had more methods, more message-laden punishments, more nightmares dressed in gold. So brush off your boots, wipe your hands, and keep going. Just maybe don't accept any dessert for a while. You push open a creaking wooden door and step into a sunlit hallway so quiet it almost startles you. The silence here isn't suspicious, it's resigned. It's the stillness of people sent away, forgotten, misplaced by power. This is the wing of banishment, where the Ottomans practiced a punishment that didn't involve blades, boiling syrup, or honey-soaked torture devices. No, this was subtler, lonelier. This was exile Ottoman style. The empire didn't always need to kill you to make you disappear. Sometimes, they just needed to remove you from the conversation entirely. So instead of a cell, you got a villa. Instead of an executioner, you got a ship ticket. But don't be fooled, this wasn't a vacation. This was soft obliteration. The hallway is lined with shelves, books, scrolls, ledgers. You pass one with a worn spine, titled simply Decrees of Distance. And that's really what exile was. Distance, calculated, and cruel. You weren't sent to some glamorous coastal retreat. You were sent to an island with more goats than people, or to a drafty mountain monastery where the wind felt like judgment. And you went alone, always alone. The Ottomans exiled viziers, poets, scholars, bureaucrats, concubines, Janissary 7 princes, who spoke too eagerly about inheritance. There wasn't always a trial. Sometimes there wasn't even a conversation, just a folded decree, a polite escort, and the realization that your house slippers would never touch top-copy tile again. You move into a larger room now, a kind of exile staging chamber, where the condemned gathered their things before departure. There's a row of travel trunks here, still labeled in fading ink. To Lesbos, to Trabzon, to Baghdad no return. The latter has a scratch through it, as if someone tried to change their mind after the ink dried. It didn't work. Historians still debate whether exile was considered a kindness or a clever cruelty. Some point out that it spared lives and avoided messy executions. Others argue it was a slower death, drawn out over years of irrelevance, poverty, and suspicion. You didn't just lose your position, you lost your audience. In the Ottoman court, to be unseen was to be undone. And for those who tried to resist, that's when things got interesting. One scholar, exiled for publishing a controversial treatise on inheritance laws, reportedly attempted to flee en route. He made it as far as the port, disguised as a merchant. When caught, his punishment was modified. Instead of being sent to the island of Boscada, he was shipped to a monastery on Mount Ara, where the only texts allowed were religious commentaries and poultry inventories. He lasted 6 months before renouncing writing altogether. After that, he spent the rest of his life as a chicken-keeping hermit, allegedly by choice. You sit briefly on one of the benches by the window. The sunlight feels oddly foreign after so many shadowy rooms. Outside, the city bustles unaware that the people in this very hall once sat here, gripping sealed orders, wondering which part of the map would become their prison. And here's a fringe detail you didn't ask for but now can't forget. There were levels of exile. Some were given a modest stipend and allowed to live in relative comfort. Others were sent with nothing but a warning not to speak, not to write, not to return. And in rare cases, they weren't sent anywhere at all. They were exiled within their own home, barred from communication, stripped of title, their rooms locked from the outside. The palace called it still exile. It was like being buried with your eyes open. You step into a smaller chamber just off the main hallway. There's a low table with maps strewn across it, dog-eared, wine-stained, curled at the corners. Each map bears a red ink mark somewhere on its surface. You trace your fingers across the names: Sinop, Edirne, Crete, Damascus. These weren't always punishments, mind you. Some exiles used their distance to their advantage. They wrote, taught, plotted. A few even returned, triumphant, summoned back when the political winds shifted. One poet famously wrote a series of sonnets so moving that the Sultan not only invited him back to court, but had his exile quarters turned into a miniature library. The poet's revenge? He wrote an ode to mold. But for most, there was no return. One concubine exiled to a provincial court in Konya spent her remaining years embroidering veils with the word unseen stitched along the hem. One for every year she spent away. She made 17. No one kept the 18th. You walk through another corridor lined with clothing left behind, robes with sun-bleached sleeves, slippers worn through the sole, satchels with broken straps. They look like artifacts from an ordinary life, and that's the point. Exile wasn't cinematic. It was quietly tragic. You didn't make a final speech. You packed your bag, handed off your key, and slipped out the back of history. Still, exile was sometimes used strategically. A clever sultan might banish a rival not to punish them, but to create the illusion of mercy. A removed prince becomes a reminder. See how generous I am. He still breathes. But should that same prince gain too much sympathy, too many letters, too many allies, well, accidents happen. Ships sink. Mountain paths collapse. Poison can be slow, even outdoors. You come to the end of the hall now. A mural stretches across the wall-stylized waves, clouds, a lone boat sailing toward a distant island. It's beautiful, peaceful, deceptive. The figure in the boat wears rich robes, but looks back over his shoulder, his face full of longing, or maybe fear. You stand there a while, trying to read the emotion. But it's painted deliberately vague, just like the Ottoman policy of exile itself. Part mercy, part menace. And just as you turn to leave, you notice something faint carved beneath the mural. Not calligraphy, not a prayer. Just 4 words, scratched in with something sharp. I still hear Istanbul. You don't know who left it. No one does. But it says everything. You walk out of the exile wing quietly, your footsteps slow. The palace has a way of swallowing people, and sometimes it's not the sharp punishments that cut the deepest. Sometimes it's the quiet, the empty rooms, the letters that stop arriving, the echo of footsteps leading away from everything you were. And now, onward, because this empire wasn't finished punishing people. It just needed a cudgel or two next. You hear it before you see a low, repetitive thunk, like someone cracking firewood rhythmically in the distance. But there's no fire nearby, only stone, and the dull echo of pain that once resided in the walls you now pass through. This part of the palace is plain-adorned walls, heavy doors, floors swept clean of any illusion. No silks, no music, no painted ceilings to distract you. This is where the empire did its dirtiest work, in full daylight. You've arrived at the practice yard for one of the most blunt instruments in the Ottoman arsenal, the iron cudgel. There's no ceremony here, no symbolism, just violence delivered with a precise institutional rhythm. If the previous punishments were artistic, layered in metaphors and political nuance, this one is a sledgehammer to the spine of imperial order. You step out into the open yard, sunlight glaring on the sand-packed ground, and you can almost feel the weight of memory in the air groans that still cling to the corners, whispers that echo long after the shouts have stopped. The cudgel was the great equalizer. Used on thieves, deserters, dishonest merchants, rebellious Janissary 7 minor officials who overstayed their welcome in the treasury. It wasn't fatal usually. It wasn't elegant ever, but it worked. A man beaten with a cudgel remembered his offense every time he rolled over in bed or bent to tie his slippers. And, if he didn't remember, Someone else surely would. That was the point. The cudgel itself wasn't ornamental. You spot a few propped in a rack near the wall, simple iron bars, roughly the length of a man's forearm, thick enough to shatter bone but narrow enough to leave bruises that bloomed for weeks. Some were wrapped in leather for grip. Others had rivets. One, disturbingly, has notches carved into the shaft. You try not to guess what they're counting. Punishment with the cudgel often took place publicly. The accused would be dragged or escorted to the center of a courtyard, sometimes stripped to the waist, sometimes bound, sometimes just forced to kneel with hands behind the head, in quiet acceptance. The executioners, always in pairs, didn't shout or scowl. They just began. One blow, then another. Thighs were the favored target, not out of mercy, but because breaking the femur took skill, and because striking the back or head could lead to death, which defeated the whole point. Suffering without martyrdom. You walk the edge of the yard now, your footsteps crunching lightly on gravel. The corner of the wall bears old chisel marks, likely, where prisoners scratched in prayers, curses, or just tallies of how many strikes they survived. One reads, 17, still breathing. Another, fainter. Name me in the next life. Historians still argue how often the cudgel was used as a tool of discipline versus a weapon of intimidation. Some claim it was routine, doled out like demerits, handed down by judges with the same detachment you'd use while ordering a pastry. Others believe it was a last resort, employed when verbal warnings failed or when officials needed to make an example. Either way, it left its mark, literally. And here's a deliciously twisted fringe detail. Some recipients of the cudgel were granted the mercy of honey. This meant their wounds were smeared with honey afterward, not for comfort, but to invite insects. The punishment didn't stop when the beating ended. No, it kept going, long into the night, as ants and flies found their way to sticky, broken skin. Allegedly, it was reserved for liars and smugglers. You wonder which was worse, the bruising or the buzzing. Of course, not everyone who received the cudgel returned to daily life. Some were crippled permanently. Others developed fevers, infections, or lost the use of limbs. There were no compensation programs, no physicians dispatched by the palace to ensure your recovery. You were lucky to be alive, and that was your reward. One butcher, punished for selling underweight meat, lost the ability to walk. He was reassigned to a position cleaning latrines in the outer districts, and still, he was considered spared. You step into a small side room, now little more than a stone bench and a bucket in the corner. This was the holding cell for those about to be punished. It still smells faintly of iron and vinegar. On the wall is a painted diagram, simple drawings, showing the correct stance for administering the cudgel. There's an art to it, apparently. Too high, and you risk internal bleeding. Too low, and you damage the ankle, which looks bad when the accused is expected to walk away afterward. The goal wasn't to maim, it was to humiliate. And speaking of humiliation, let's talk about the cuffs. After a beating, the punished were sometimes forced to parade through the streets with iron cuffs, still attached, clinking with each step, dragging their swollen legs across stone roads, while citizens were encouraged to look. Not always jeer, sometimes just look. Public accountability. Ottoman style. You exit the holding cell and find yourself back in the practice yard. There's a raised platform at the far end, only a few feet high. It was said to be where higher-ranking offenders received their punishments, set apart slightly from the commoners. Their beatings were quieter, less public, more elegant, if such a word can be applied to an iron club. A scribe's account from 1,653 notes, watching a vizier punished for bribery. 30 strokes, no screams. Just the sound of cloth tearing and the soft gasp of a man realizing his place in the empire had just changed permanently. And here's the kicker. Some punishments were symbolic. A man might be sentenced to 40 strokes with the cudgel, but only received 10, with the rest held in reserve for any future misbehavior. Imagine living with that, knowing there's a number hanging over you like a thundercloud, just waiting to be completed. You walk the yard once more, slower now. The cudgel wasn't about death, it was about memory, about forging obedience in bone. And the Ottoman state wielded it like a chisel-shaping behavior with pain that didn't kill, but refused to fade. As you leave the yard, your legs feel heavier. You're walking fine, of course. But your imagination has done its work. Each step echoes with the rhythm of the cudgel, the silent cries of the punished, the muted satisfaction of an empire that believed in balance above all else, even if it had to beat it into people. The light changes as you step beyond the courtyard, filtered now through narrow slits in the stone walls. It feels like you've entered a cathedral of silent stone columns rising around you like ribs, casting long ribs of shadow across the floor. At first, the space seems unremarkable, a bit empty, a bit drafty. But then you notice the strange markings on the ground, lines drawn in chalk or coal, loops and circles arranged with too much intention to be accidental. And then, resting at the far end of the room, are bows, not musical ones. Military-grade, recurved, polished bows, with quivers, and a dummy, slumped forward, straw spilling from a shoulder already split by past impact. You're in the training hall, but this wasn't just for practice. This is where some men were turned into targets. Welcome to execution by archery. Yes, the Ottomans, masters of siege warfare, custodians of poetic justice, sometimes used their elite archers not just for defending borders but for dispatching criminals. It wasn't routine, but it wasn't fiction either. A rebellious soldier, a traitorous messenger, a foreign spy, anyone the state wanted, gone in a way that was both precise and theatrical, might find themselves tied to a post here, standing where you're standing now, heartbeat racing, as the Sultan's finest lined up with arrows notched. Execution by arrow wasn't just about death, it was about control, about distance. A sword, a cudgel, even a bowstring strangulation meant you had to get close to the condemned. But arrows? They could deliver judgment from across a courtyard, from a balcony, from behind a veil. You didn't have to see the face, you just had to aim. You walked toward the straw dummy, its frame sagging like an exhausted witness. In Ottoman military tradition, archery was sacred. Janissaries were trained from youth, and tournaments were held in their honor. Hitting a coin-sized target from 100 paces wasn't uncommon. So imagine what they could do to a man standing still, arms tied behind him, knowing full well he was being reduced from a problem into a pincushion. There's a quirk to this method, though. Not all executions by arrow were direct. Sometimes it was more suggestive. A single arrow, loosed from a rooftop or balcony, could be sent through a courtier's turban as a warning, just enough to graze the scalp, enough to remind them that even the most carefully spoken lies could be overheard. And in some cases, that single arrow was followed by many more. Historians still argue whether the archery executions were done by the Janissaries themselves or a special corps of palace bowmen. Some suggest that the condemned were given one final chance to survive, placed at a distance with a single post as cover, and told, if you make it to the gate, you go free. The odds weren't good. Most didn't even try. But the few who did added an air of sport to the otherwise clinical process. Here's a fringe fact to sharpen your senses. Archers occasionally practiced blindfolded. Not always, of course, but in some palace traditions, a blindfolded shot was a sign of supreme discipline. One account from the court of Selim II describes a blindfolded executioner striking the heart of a bound prisoner from 70 paces. It was hailed as a miracle. The prisoner, notably, did not share that opinion. You reach the platform where the condemned once stood. It's marked by little more than a circular stain and a carved inscription that reads, Let the arrow fly where the word failed. You try not to think too hard about the words that must have come before the arrow. And yes, there were rules. A condemned man had to stand upright. Kneeling was considered dishonorable to the archer. Arms could be bound, but the head had to be left uncovered. Executioners believed it was more righteous to see a man's eyes before delivering death. That's the kind of detail you don't forget. Occasionally, a condemned man was allowed to speak a final prayer or recite a verse from the Quran, and some archers reportedly waited for the final syllable before loosing their arrows, not out of compassion, but because mistiming the shot was considered unlucky. Superstition wove itself into every arrow shaft, every leather grip, every breath held before release. You examine a bow now, resting on a velvet-lined case. It's lighter than expected, yet taut with tension even in repose. Ottoman bows were a marvel of design crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, curved for maximum range and accuracy. In the hands of a master, it could send an arrow faster than a horse at full gallop. And when that arrow bore a silk ribbon around the shaft, that was a signal. This was not practice. This was finality. But sometimes the condemned weren't tied. Sometimes they were used as moving targets. Here's where things spiral into fringe cruelty. During certain military drills, traitorous soldiers, those accused of cowardice or theft in the field, were made to run across the training yard, while archers took turns trying to hit non-lethal zones, thighs, shoulders, arms. The goal? Prolong suffering. Demonstrate control. You weren't just shot. You were used to prove someone else's discipline. You cross into a side room now, a smaller training space lined with targets painted in concentric circles. Some bear names. Others are marked with titles. Spy, thief, liar. They're not labeled for sport. These were rehearsal tools targets that helped executioners sharpen their conscience by reducing humans into categories. You wonder how many real men stood where these targets now hang. Probably more than history admits. One final hallway leads to an alcove where a single weathered bow rests on a rack. Beneath it is a folded turban. No blood, no bone, just the suggestion of what came before. It's part memorial, part warning. The bowstring has long since loosened, but you can almost hear it tightening, vibrating with the memory of 100 silent kills. Execution by arrow wasn't loud. It didn't carry the drama of decapitation or the slow horror of flaying, but it was precise, poised, professional, a judgment that flew through the air on fletched wings. And in the hands of the Ottomans, it became something almost poetic, because even death in this empire had choreography. As you step back into the corridor, you realize you're walking in, retracing the flight path of 100 forgotten arrows, each one aimed, each one remembered, just not by name. You climb a narrow staircase carved into stone so thick it muffles even your breathing. The steps are shallow but endless, spiraling up into a part of the palace few dared to visit without an invitation, and you're beginning to understand why. There's no music here, no scent of roses or cardamom, just a draft curling through the cracks in the walls and the creaking groan of something big, something heavy, settling above you. When you finally reach the top, you're greeted by an open-air courtyard notched into the rooftop, completely enclosed, except for the sky above. And, waiting in the center of it, rising out of the earth like a terrible monument to stubborn gravity, is a slab of stone surrounded by ropes, pulleys, and tracks. You've reached the chamber of weight. The Ottomans called it Esme Sezasooth, punishment of crushing, not metaphorical crushing, not emotional. This was a literal art form, one that involved pressure, calculation, and just enough ceremony to count as imperial justice. In a world that already featured boiling syrup and flying arrows, crushing might seem a bit old school, primitive even, but here, it was anything but. This wasn't a runaway boulder or an impulsive stoning. This was deliberate, purposeful, an execution that arrived not with a scream, but with a slow, grinding exhale. The platform beneath your feet is worn smooth, the stones bearing telltale grooves where heavy objects were once dragged or rolled into place. Some sources say it was marble. Others insist it was lead metal so dense that one slab could pin a man to the earth without fully killing him at first. And here's the disturbing genius of it. Crushing didn't always mean death by stone. Sometimes it meant hours of progressive pressure. A chest slowly flattened under shifting weight. A leg bent the wrong way until the bones cracked like dry wood. And the condemned? Usually gagged, often bound, occasionally blindfolded, though that last detail depended on how cruel the executioner was feeling that day. You examine one of the pulleys along the wall, rusted, but still sound. It's connected to a system of counterweights. Ingenious, horrifying, almost certainly designed by someone with an appreciation for physics and very questionable ethics. The weight could be adjusted, small stones added or removed during the punishment, depending on how much resistance the prisoner showed. Too much defiance? Add a basket of bricks? Too quick a collapse? Remove some, draw it out. This was slow justice, thick with symbolism. The empire didn't need to raise its voice. It just pressed down. Historians still argue whether the crushing punishment was more common in frontier regions, where the imperial grasp was looser and required more theatrical shows of strength, or whether it had a place within the very heart of Topkapi itself. Some claim that the stone you're standing on is the same slab used to punish mutinous guards during the 16th century. Others think it was repurposed from older Byzantine foundations, reused, reshaped, given a darker purpose under the Ottomans. Either way, your feet are touching something that once flattened rebellion into silence. And here's a fringe detail for your collection of nightmares. Elephants. Yes, elephants. In rare and highly publicized events, criminals, usually those found guilty of repeated treason or mass betrayal, were crushed under the feet of elephants. These elephants weren't wild, they were trained. Not to stomp, but to press. To kneel slowly. Controlled, crushing. You might imagine an enormous beast smashing a man with a single angry lunge. But no, these were elephants taught to balance delicately, lowering one foot at a time until the breath was pressed out of a man's lungs like juice from a grape. At least one chronicler describes a crowd applauding as the elephant lifted its foot, revealing the flattened chest of a former vizier who had embezzled enough silver to pave a road to Egypt. Of course, not all crushing ended in death. Sometimes the punishment was light crushing, not a term you ever want to hear out of context. The accused might be pinned just long enough to dislocate joints or cause permanent nerve damage. One poet, accused of sedition for slipping a double-meaning line into a festival ode, was allegedly crushed just enough to ruin his hands. He survived. He even kept writing by dictation. But the message was clear. The empire might enjoy your art, but not at its own expense. You pace the edges of the chamber now, your boots making little sound against the uneven flagstone. The walls are high, windowless. This wasn't a place for escape. No one climbed out. No one looked in. And yet, it wasn't hidden. Executions here were often attended by low-ranking officials, scribes, and palace guards witnesses, tasked with recording not just the punishment, but the demeanor of the punished. Crying? Weakness. Stoicism? Perhaps grounds for a posthumous note of dignity. There were even rumors of betting small wagers placed on how long a prisoner could withstand the pressure before bones gave way. It's amazing how the empire managed to turn even agony into entertainment. You spot a rope coiled neatly in a recess beside the pulley, frayed at the ends but still strong. It was likely used to bind the arms or hold weights in place during descent. Nearby, a stone basin rests under a spout, not for washing, for catching runoff. That's all you're going to think about that. Some records suggest that, occasionally, the condemned were given a final chance to confess or offer a verse from Scripture before the weight descended. A few brave yet foolish souls chose instead to curse their captors or demand proof of guilt. One such prisoner, a military engineer accused of espionage, refused to speak. The weight was applied, inch by inch. It took 6 hours. The engineer never uttered a word. That, apparently, became his legacy. And then, there's the part no one wants to say aloud. The sound. Crushing isn't loud. It's not a scream or a bang. It's the slow, rhythmic shifting of stone. A creak of wood. A soft crack like firewood splitting under snow. You might not even notice it at first until it happens again, and again, and again. You stand in the center of the courtyard, the sun directly overhead now. There's no ceremony. No one is here but you. Yet you feel watched. The stone slab beneath your feet radiates a chill, even under the midday heat. You close your eyes and imagine the weight above you, the creak of the pulley, the long, drawn-out descent of punishment. And suddenly, standing still feels harder than walking. You step away. Carefully. Crushing wasn't just a punishment, it was a philosophy. It reminded everyone in the empire that power could be gradual. That obedience wasn't always bought in blood, but in pressure, in inevitability, in weight that arrived slowly and stayed long after the body was gone. You pass through the archway leading out of the chamber, sunlight breaking like water across your shoulders. You're lighter now, not physically, but by contrast. After what you've seen, every uncrushed breath feels like luxury. But don't get too comfortable. The empire had many more ways to press down, and some of them lived on far after the body was buried. You descend from the crushing chamber along a corridor that narrows with every step, until even your breath feels too loud. The walls here grow cold again, stone turning slick with condensation, and somewhere far off you hear water dripping in regular beats, like a metronome set to dread. You don't need to guess anymore, you know what kind of place this is. You've arrived at the oubliette. The word sounds French, and it is, but the Ottomans had their own version of it. An utma zindanuthe, cell of forgetting, not a jail, not a prison, a disappearing act. You step through an iron-barred door into a small circular chamber, carved entirely underground. The air is stale, heavy with mildew, and the unmistakable scent of long-decayed straw. This room wasn't meant to hold you. It was meant to erase you. The Ottomans, for all their elaborate methods of punishment, understood that sometimes the most terrifying fate wasn't death or pain, it was being removed so completely that even your name lost its edges. This cell was for people the state no longer wanted to execute, but could not allow to live freely. A place where crimes, secrets, or inconvenient bloodlines were sent to evaporate. The design was genius in its horror. No windows, no torches, just a shaft from above, thin enough to let air in, but not light. Food was lowered in small baskets once a day, if that. And water, brackish and lukewarm, collected in shallow depressions in the stone. The idea wasn't just confinement, it was unmooring, a slow erosion of self. Men placed here were not given trials. They weren't logged in records. They weren't even called prisoners. They were simply gone. You move to the center of the room where faint scratch marks cover the floor. Some spiral. Others tick along in rose days, perhaps, or names. One reads, "I sang once." Another says, "She warned me." There's something childlike in the etchings, like a desperate person trying to leave behind any echo of identity. You imagine fingers, raw from clawing at stone, throats gone hoarse from calling to no one. The darkness would have come first, then the silence. Then the realization, you weren't being punished, you were being forgotten. Historians still debate how often the Ottomans used oubliette cells. Some claim they were rare, reserved for internal palace intrigue or high-level treason. Others believe they were more common than records suggest because, well, the whole point was not to record. Most agree that at least a few royal brothers, ex-lovers of sultanas, and out-of-favor court astrologers ended their lives here. And not because they screamed, because they didn't, because silence made it easier. And here's a fringe fact to haunt your dreams. Some oubliettes were designed with angled walls, creating subtle echoes that disoriented the imprisoned. You'd hear your own breath bouncing back at strange intervals. A whispered word would come from behind you. A footstep yours might seem to belong to someone else. The result? A slow, calculated unraveling of the mind. It wasn't torture, exactly. It was loneliness with architectural ambition. You kneel beside a corner where a shallow groove runs along the wall carved deliberately. It's a water channel, barely wider than your thumb, sloping gently downward. These channels connected to deeper cisterns beneath the palace, ensuring that even the most hidden cells wouldn't flood. Ingenious. Also depressing. The builders cared more about the plumbing than the people. One account tells of a political advisor who displeased the Sultan by recommending too bold a foreign alliance. Instead of execution, he was placed in an oubliette for 7 years. When he was eventually retrieved, because sometimes they did check back and he's had no teeth left and spoke only in fragments of verse. He died within a month, convinced he was still underground. Another story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not, describes a woman accused of revealing secrets from the harem to a European ambassador. She was placed in the cell not to punish her, but to coerce information. Each day she didn't speak. The cell remained sealed. After 2 months, she supposedly confessed to everything, including things she couldn't possibly have known. Whether her words were true or simply the byproduct of unrelenting darkness, no one cared. The confession stood. Her body, however, did not. It was never recovered. You run your hand along the wall. It's clammy, unyielding. The stones have absorbed centuries of silence. You wonder if they remember every cry, every whisper, every footstep above that never came close enough. It's hard not to feel a chill. This is the kind of punishment that doesn't require violence to be terrifying. The fear here is existential. To live in this cell is to learn what it means to vanish before death. But of course, the Ottomans didn't always keep the oubliettes occupied. Some were emptied, cleaned, resealed. Some were left to decay, their victims long since bones. And some, according to fringe legend, were sealed with the prisoner still alive inside, the shaft above bricked shut, the final basket of food lowered with a prayer and a sigh. In this version of justice, mercy was a sealed roof. You exit the chamber with slow steps, the weight of the place pressing behind your eyes. Back in the corridor, light returns gradually: torches, lamps, slits in the stone. You blink like someone awakening from a bad dream, except the dream left scratches on your memory. You breathe a little deeper, walk a little faster. The Empire had many ways to end a life, but the oubliette was different. It didn't end you. It suspended you permanently. And now, as you return to the palace proper, you can't help but glance over your shoulder once, just to make sure the door behind you stays open, just to remind yourself that you're still visible, still remembered, still here. You emerge from the oubliette corridor into a quiet vestibule of polished stone and soft lamplight. It's almost jarring how clean, how elegant, how normal it feels after the cell of forgetting. Here, the walls are decorated with geometric tilework, delicate as lace and cool to the touch. A brass incense burner puffs lazy spirals into the air, and ahead, a polished wooden door swings open on silent hinges, revealing a room that smells faintly of rosewater and parchment. Don't be fooled. You've entered the Bureau of False Scribeshome, to one of the Empire's most curious and cerebral punishments: enforced transcription. That's right. Not every punishment involved broken bones or burning syrup. Sometimes, it just involved a very sore wrist, a locked room, and an endless supply of ink. You step inside, and instantly, the atmosphere changes. This isn't a torture chamber. It's a library. Desks line the room in neat rows, each with inkwells, sharpened quills, and stacks of vellum or rice paper. The silence hums with centuries of reluctant obedience. You're standing in what the Ottomans called the Hafsuz Khatip Salanutha Hall of the bound scribes. And bound they were, not metaphorically, literally. Punished clerks, forgers, or treasonous poets could be sentenced not to death, but to endless copying. Legal texts, court records, the Quran. Entire bureaucratic manuals rewritten by hand, over and over. Think of it like imperial detention, but with carpal tunnel and the constant scent of lamp oil. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't painful. It was just draining. You approach one of the desks, where a faded page lies unfinished. It's a financial report from 1589, halfway through a sentence about tithes on olive oil exports. You can almost feel the sigh embedded in the handwriting. Some historians estimate that thousands of such pages were penned by men who once held higher offices, viziers reduced to scribes, poets punished for wit, janissaries literate enough to be punished creatively. This punishment wasn't about physical suffering. It was about mental erosion. You weren't beaten, you weren't whipped. You were made to write, 10 hours a day, every day. Your food was served in silence, your sleeping mat laid behind your desk. Your only conversations were with paper and ink. And if you smudged a line or failed to maintain the proper calligraphic flourishes, you started over, from the beginning. Historians still argue whether this punishment was reserved for intellectual crime, subversive writings, falsified documents, forbidden books, or if it was also used for more mundane offenses by bureaucrats. Too valuable to kill, but too dangerous to trust. Some scholars claim that several entire compilations of tax codes were penned exclusively by punished scribes. Others whisper that a few of the surviving illuminated manuscripts, gorgeous, detailed, aching with artistry, were actually the result of punitive labor, beauty, under duress. And here's a fringe tidbit for your trivia drawer. Some punished scribes were made to copy the same book repeatedly, but with one deliberate error inserted. Not a typo, a political tweak, a line rephrased, a symbol shifted. These manipulated manuscripts were then circulated carefully, subtly altering the record. The punishment became propaganda. Imagine being forced to rewrite history until your hand blistered and, knowing that your mistake would become someone else's truth. You pass another desk and spot a pair of wrist shackles nailed into the wood. Not for torture, just to keep hands in place. Prisoners who tried to slack off or scribble nonsense were bound until they remembered how to hold a quill properly. Some scribes learned to write with both hands, alternating when the cramps got too bad. A few allegedly developed a rhythmic trance, entering a kind of meditative flow as they copied script after script. Mind-numbing? Yes. Spirit-breaking? Often. But occasionally. Oddly transcendent. One punished clerk, in a letter smuggled out to his brother, wrote, "I no longer think of the meaning, only the movement. I am the pen, not the thought." Poetic. Depressing. Also probably a little exaggerated, but you get the idea. And not everyone survived the punishment unscathed. One famed astronomer, condemned for publishing politically inconvenient calculations about solar eclipses, was sentenced to 10 years in the scribe chamber. He emerged half-blind, stooped, but still scribbling. He continued copying texts voluntarily for the rest of his life, reportedly unable to stop his fingers from forming script, even in sleep. The walls of the chamber are covered with shelves, each packed with scrolls and folios. You pull one down at random. It's a listing of shipping licenses for the Aegean coast, dated 1641. Dry stuff. But on the final page, in the margin, someone has scribbled a note. The sea cannot be taxed, but we try. A little jab of sarcasm, hidden in bureaucracy. Proof that, even in punishment, humor survives. You step into a smaller side room, now a break room, in theory. There's a clay water jug, a worn rug, a low bench. A single barred window lets in light. This was the only spot where the punished scribes could speak, briefly, during evening rest. And what did they talk about? Likely their hands, their backs, the endless repetition, but also poetry, memory, language. Some say a few conspiracies were born here, written in whispers before being penned into existence in careful, coded calligraphy. Here's something strange. A few scribes petitioned to remain after their sentence ended. They had no families left, no titles to reclaim. They found peace in the motion, a kind of identity in the repetition. That's the danger of quiet punishments. They don't break you, they fold you in. You walk the perimeter one more time, noticing now the grooves worn into the floor beneath each desk, footpaths from men rocking back and forth, endlessly, as they wrote their penance line by line. It's hypnotic, tragic, kind of beautiful, in a harrowing way. The Ottomans knew that not all punishment had to draw blood. Sometimes, the slow drain of identity replaced by words that weren't yours, thoughts you couldn't believe in, and ink that refused to fade was enough. Sometimes, justice arrived not with a blade, but with a blank page. You exit quietly, past the desks and ink-stained quills, back into the hallway. Your fingers itch, as if they've been writing for hours. You flex them once, twice, and keep walking. Because the empire wasn't done yet. There were still more ways to punish a body and, even more ways to punish a soul. The hallway tilts slightly downward again, and with each step the light grows dimmer, shifting from golden to gray, as if you're walking out of time itself. The lamps here burn low, their oil thick and slow burning, and the air starts to taste faintly of metal, not rust. Exactly more like iron that's been scraped, forged, and cooled 1,000 times over. You pass a set of arched doorways with iron rings bolted to the walls, and finally arrive at what looks like a smithy, though no tools hang from the racks. No tongs, no hammers, just an empty forgend, a long gleaming row of manacles. You found the punishment of the heated collar. Yes, a collar. For humans. Worn not as a fashion statement, but as a method of controlled suffering. In the vast menu of Ottoman discipline, this one was quiet, portable, and excruciating. The Ateşli Halka, literally, the fiery loop, was punishment for arrogance, insolence, and insubordination, especially among soldiers and lesser nobility. You didn't scream your way through this one. You sweated, you trembled, and you prayed that your skin healed evenly. You approach the workbench in the center of the room, where an iron band lies open like a terrible necklace. It's not sharp, not jagged, just thick and perfectly circular, designed to clamp around the neck or shoulders. In its cold state, it's already intimidating. But when heated in the forge behind you, when it glowed a dull red and was latched shut with a special key, that's when it made its point. Quite literally, the punishment didn't always kill. That wasn't its purpose. It was more about branding, about humiliation that couldn't be wiped off or washed away. The heated collar might be applied for minutes or hours, depending on the severity of the crime and the patience of the punisher. Often, it left a permanent ring of scar tissue just below the jawline, like a warning label, like a signature. And the worst part? Sometimes the collar wasn't even hot. Sometimes it was just cold iron, worn day and night for weeks at a time, rubbing raw against the skin until infection set in. Whether hot or not, the message was clear. This person belongs to punishment. This person carries their sentence wherever they go. Historians still argue about the origins of the heated collar. Some say it was adapted from Persian military discipline, where metal rings were used to control prisoners of war. Others believe it evolved from an older Byzantine practice of symbolic shackling punishment, not for escape, but for shame. Whatever its lineage, by the height of the Ottoman Empire, the heated collar had become a distinct and dreadful tradition, reserved for those who needed to suffer visibly but not fatally. You pass a rack of collars now, each engraved with symbols, crescent moons, stars, eyes. These weren't decorative. They denoted the rank of the person punished, and sometimes the reason. A broken sword symbol might indicate treason. A closed eye meant disobedience, and a small fish, oddly enough, symbolized gluttony. Yes, you could be punished with metal jewelry for hoarding palace food. One cook, known for secretly selling saffron from the Sultan's private stockpile, wore a collar for 3 weeks until his skin turned purple. He later became a monk, presumably one with bland recipes. Here's your fringe fact for this room. Some collars weren't locked in place by guards, but by the punished themselves. The offender was given the glowing metal band and told to fasten it around their own neck in front of witnesses. If they refused, the sentence was doubled. This was called the turn of repentance. Only a few dared hesitate. One janissary, famous for defying orders during a city siege, reportedly fastened his collar with a steady hand and didn't flinch once. He died of infection 5 days later, but his name became a rallying cry among other soldiers, not in sympathy, but in stubborn admiration. You turn and look toward the forge itself, cold now, but the ash beneath it still smells of iron. A chain dangles from a hook above it, ending in a collar suspended like a warning bell. The ground beneath is scored with drag marks. You imagine the punishment process. The accused, led in by guards, told to kneel. The collar heated to a searing glow, the moment of contact, the locking sound, the silence afterward. And then, they're sent back out. Back into the court, the street, the garrison. Because this punishment didn't remove you, it reshaped you. You were expected to live with it, to work with it, to be seen. The collar became your second name. Some accounts describe victims being instructed to carry mirrors with them, small polished discs, so they could see the mark they wore. The logic? Constant reflection breeds obedience. It's disturbingly poetic. Also infuriating. And then there's the rumor, almost certainly exaggerated, that a scribe once punished with the collar took to writing exclusively with his left hand to avoid touching the scar on his right shoulder. His calligraphy changed, became slanted, unfamiliar. The Sultan noticed, demanded an explanation. Upon learning the reason, he is said to have ordered the scribe freed, rewarded, and made a royal tutor. Whether or not it happened, the story persisted for generations as a parable of survival through stubborn refinement. You step into a side alcove where ceremonial versions of the collar are stored, gilded, encrusted with dull rubies, designed not to hurt but to symbolize past punishments survived. Some nobles, having endured the collar and outlived their disgrace, wore replicas to court, a kind of grotesque badge of honor. "Look what I endured," their jewelry whispered, "and look where I stand now." The empire loved a redemption arc so long as it didn't challenge the hierarchy. Before leaving, you glance one last time at the iron band on the bench. Its edges catch the light, casting a faint, ominous circle on the wall. You reach out, not to touch, but to trace its shadow. It's too small for your imagination to escape. You step away. The collar was punishment with permanence. A pain that traveled with you, sat at your table, appeared in your mirror. It didn't kill, it reminded, it whispered, it lingered. Back in the corridor, your skin feels cool, suddenly aware of its freedom. No weight pressing into your throat, no lock clamping down. You breathe a little deeper and continue walking. Because for all the things the Ottomans pressed, broke, carved, or caged, there were still punishments that went even deeper, into the realm of dreams, of memory, of the self. You move deeper into the belly of the palace now, where corridors narrow, Ceilings sag with humidity, and the oil lamps burn a little shorter, as if unsure how long they're expected to last. The air takes on a dry sweetness, not floral, not herbal, something sharper. You follow it until it becomes unmistakable. Incense, yes, but beneath it, opium. You've just arrived at a punishment hall the Ottomans rarely advertised but quietly maintained for centuries. Welcome to the dream cell. Unlike the oubliette, this place wasn't built to erase. It was built to distort. The Ottomans had discovered, long before Western psychology caught up, that pain wasn't the only way to break a mind. Confuse it enough, warp its sense of time, space, language, and the self becomes malleable, flexible, punishable. The Ruya Odasa, or dream room, wasn't made of whips and chains. It was made of cushions, incense, hallucinogens, and sleepless nights. You step inside and find a room unlike any of the others. The floor is layered in rugs and pillows, soft to the point of disorientation. The walls are covered in drapesome silk, some simple burlap, dyed in spiraling patterns that seem to move if you stare too long. There's no window, just flickering lanterns hung at odd angles, casting shadows that don't make sense. And in the far corner, a bronze brazier still holds the dusty remains of something burnt slowly, intentionally. Poppies, most likely. Crushed petals blended with clove, myrrh, maybe even henbane. The scent alone makes your pulse lag half a beat. This was punishment by disorientation, a kind of psychological exile. You weren't starved. You weren't beaten. You were drugged lightly at first, and then saturated with whispers, symbols, colors. Sometimes you were left awake for days. Sometimes put into dreamless sleep for weeks. The goal wasn't to make you hurt. It was to make you doubt yourself. Historians still debate whether the dream room was purely punitive or partly experimental. Some argue it was the brainchild of court physicians tasked with finding bloodless correction. Others believe it was designed by a former mystic-turned-interrogator who'd once trained with Sufi ascetics. Either way, it served a clear purpose. It turned loud men quiet. Convicted traitors, disgraced poets, outspoken eunuchs, they were led here, and returned changed, not always broken, just quiet. You walk along a bench lined with odd items, musical instruments with missing strings, jars of pigment, scrolls with nothing written on them. Objects meant to provoke the mind, not inform it. In the dream cell, language itself unraveled. Some punished were made to speak only in metaphor for a full month. Others were taught meaningless alphabets and forced to write reports no one would ever read. If you protested, the room grew dimmer. If you obeyed, the walls shifted, curtains removed, new light let in. A behavioral labyrinth, disguised as therapy. And here's your fringe curiosity. They used birds. Not many. Just a few. Songbirds kept in small cages around the room. The twist? They only sang when the lights were dimmed, creating the eerie sensation of music emerging from darkness. If the prisoner closed their eyes, the song seemed to float inside their skull. Some described it as beautiful. Others claimed it was the worst part. The punishment typically lasted 40 days, a mystical number in Islamic tradition. Long enough for a full cycle of fasting, reflection, rebirth. But here, it wasn't sacred. It was strategic. 40 days of dreams, interrupted sleep, strange meals, and colors that changed without explanation. At the end, you were brought before a low-ranking official and asked only one question: who are you now? And your answer determined your releaser, your return. You kneel beside a tray of old ink pots, most dried out, one still gummy. Next to them, a mirror, cracked down the middle, as if someone flinched mid-reflection. It's not hard to imagine why. In the dream room, mirrors weren't vanity, they were tools. You were asked to look at yourself while reciting your name, then while reciting your crime, then while explaining what you believed, over and over. until the reflection stopped making sense. Some prisoners broke completely. A few were never coherent again, but others emerged strangely enhanced. One former court mathematician, punished for mocking the Grand Vizier in a ciphered poem, returned from the dream room with a new theorem he swore came to him in a vision. It was later used in bridge engineering. Another man, once a rebellious dervish, emerged claiming to have spoken with a lion made of smoke. He never spoke again, but smiled constantly. They let him go. You step into an adjoining alcove where slanted light filters through colored glass. A low platform with ropes on each side sits in the center, possibly for guided dreaming or induced sleep paralysis. A document nearby lists herbs and dosages. Mugwort, mandrake, saffron. Not fatal, just mind-altering. Some punishments weren't about making you suffer. They were about making you someone else. And let's not pretend this was all mysticism. The Ottomans knew their pharmacology. Court physicians documented how long it took for specific blends to induce confusion, obedience, or euphoria. They charted recovery times, adjusted dosages. Sometimes you were allowed to dream of freedom, only to awaken chained again. And that, they believed, was more powerful than pain. Because now you'd tasted escape and had it taken back. The floor here still holds subtle indentations where cushions were arranged, bodies reclined, rituals performed. One etching in the tile reads, "I dreamed of birds. None of them flew." Another, scratched in haste, says only, "Don't trust the colors." You leave the dream room slowly, blinking harder than usual. The hallway outside feels sharper, now realer. But part of you wonders if that's just what the dream room wants you to think. It's said that some punishments don't end with release. They just linger, waiting, softly reshaping every memory until the pain feels like poetry and the truth feels like fiction. And that was the genius of it. The Ottomans didn't need to whip you into obedience. They could just rearrange you, quietly, beautifully. And if you were lucky, you'd never know it happened. The hallway veers off now into a narrow corridor that smells faintly of salt and old rope. You follow the scent down a steep ramp where the stones turn slick and mossy underfoot. The air grows damp, the ceiling lower, until you finally push through a wooden door and find yourself face to face with water. Dark, brackish, and still. You've entered the cistern levels beneath the palacy ancient reservoirs that once sustained a city, but were quietly repurposed for another use. Welcome to the drowning cell. The Ottomans didn't use this place for mass executions or theatrical punishment. No, this was more personal, reserved for betrayal within the inner circle. A punishment handed out in whispers, behind closed doors, sometimes without even a public accusation. Here, the water didn't just drown it, erased. It cleansed the Empire's mistakes by hiding them deep below the surface. You step out onto a slick stone walkway that skirts the edge of a vast subterranean pool. Arches rise from the water, their reflections shimmering with torchlight. Chains dangle from the ceiling above, some ending in manacles, others simply trailing like limp reminders. This wasn't a room for flailing chaos. It was calm. Chillingly calm. The kind of place where screams were muffled before they even reached the surface. At the far end of the cistern, there's a platform with a hinged planka kind of trapdoor device. This was known as Sukapusu, the water gate. Prisoners were brought here blindfolded, told they were being led to confession or reprieve. Then, without ceremony, they were bound and dropped into the water. Some were pulled back up. Others weren't. Historians still argue whether drowning was used as a form of execution or a method of punishment intended to terrorize rather than kill. Some claim prisoners were submerged repeatedly, held under until the brink of unconsciousness, then hauled back to sputter and gaspingly to be lowered again. This dunking process might go on for hours or days. It depended entirely on the whims of those in charge and the value of what the accused might confess. You crouch near the water's edge. It's silent now, but your imagination easily fills in the gasps, the gurgles, the whispered pleas for breath. According to some chroniclers, a few condemned men developed techniques to slow their heart rate, to conserve breath, to survive longer underwater. These men were often remembered not for their crimes, but for their endurance. One story tells of a palace guard accused of passing notes to the harem. He survived 19 submersions over 3 nights. On the 4th night, he confessed, not to betrayal, but to loving the girl he'd written to. The story ends there. No one ever mentions whether he survived the final drop. And here's your fringe tidbit. Occasionally, water was laced with crushed herbs either calming or mildly toxic. Mandrake root, for example, was known to cause disorientation and slowed breathing. It made the drowning sensation stranger, dreamlike. Some victims claimed afterward they felt like they were floating in sky, not water. Others couldn't remember anything at all. The punishment was often paired with silence. No official charges were read. No crowds were gathered. Sometimes the victim was told they were being taken to the baths, a dark joke, if ever there was one. And when they failed to return, their disappearance was explained away as reassignment, exile, or illness. The water took them, and the empire moved on. Ripples don't last forever. You step onto the wooden platform and peer down through the trapdoor's grating. Beneath it, the water is impossibly still. Cold light filters through a single shaft above, casting long shadows across the surface. A metal pole with leather loops sits to one side, used to bind ankles before immersion. The weight of it in your hand is shocking, not because it's heavy, but because it's so ordinary. Brutality often hides in tools that look like nothing special. Some prisoners were left in the water for days not submerged, but waist-deep, shackled in place, their skin softening, cracking, blistering from the damp, a punishment of waiting, of knowing the next dip might be the last. And because the cistern was far below the palace, no screams could be heard. No pleading reached the rooms above. Time slowed. The empire's gears kept turning. And here, in the shadows, someone quietly ceased to be. You move through another archway into a side chamber where shallow pools line the floor. These were known as the Basma Tashlari, or stepping stones. Prisoners were made to walk back and forth across them, blindfolded, unsure if each step would lead to dry footing or sudden plunge. The psychological toll was immense. Many confessed before their feet were even wet. A logbook carved into the wall lists names not prisoners, but guards, not dates, but hours, shifts. This was meticulous work. The drowning punishment wasn't chaotic. It was scheduled, managed, tracked. There was no room for mercy here, just efficiency, and yet some survived. A few men, later released, described the sensation as strangely peaceful. One said it was like returning to the womb-silent, warm, detached. Another claimed he heard music underwater, maybe hallucinations, maybe trauma, or maybe the empire, in its twisted genius, had stumbled onto something more ancient than punishment, transformation through terror. You step back out into the main chamber and look across the water one last time. Somewhere beneath that surface, hundreds of stories ended. Not in fire, not in blood, but in quiet, bubbling surrender. A kind of hush the empire found useful, even elegant, because sometimes the most brutal punishments didn't scar the body, they just stopped the voice. The Ottomans understood this, and in rooms like this one, they perfected it. You turn away, your footsteps echoing along the stone, louder than they should be. Above you, the palace thrives. Sultans hold court. Music plays. But down here, beneath the silks and speeches, the water still waits, still dark, still ready. You climb slowly now, back from the damp chambers of the drowned, into a higher part of the palace. The steps are uneven again. worn down by centuries of footfalls, and your calves protest with every rise. The air grows warmer, tinged with sandalwood and iron. Up ahead, torchlight flickers against a thick wooden door, etched with odd symbol serows, teeth, crescents, all arranged in no pattern you can decipher. This is the Chamber of Mirrors, but not the elegant kind you find in ballrooms. No gilded edges here. This is the place where the Ottomans punished through forced reflection, both literal and psychological. You push open the door and step inside. The room is circular, domed, its ceiling lost in shadow. Every wall surface is covered with reflective panels, not glass, but polished metal, warped slightly, like the inside of a bowl. Some are convex, some concave, others wavy like melted silver. The result? You see yourself 100 times over, but never the same way twice. One reflection makes your limbs long and insect-like. Another compresses your face into a blur. Step left, and you watch your image fracture into dozens of anxious versions, each blinking a beat too late. This was punishment by distortion. The Ottomans called it Ayna Hukresi, the mirror cell. It was reserved for crimes of identity, impersonation, false prophecy, political dissent wrapped in poetry, and the worst offense of all, deceiving the Sultan. For these criminals, death was too clean. Instead, they were left in this chamber for days at a time, fed little, allowed no writing tools, no company, nothing but water and a room full of broken selves. And here's the catch. The mirrors weren't just decorative. Some were enchanted, or at least believed to be. The court's astrologers and mystics claimed they could bend the soul through repeated exposure. Let him see what he truly is, the phrase often went. Or, let the room remind him why he hides. Historians still argue whether the mirror cell had any mystical power at all. Some believe it was a clever psychological trick. Others insist certain metals, polished tin, mercury alloy were chosen specifically for their soul-calling qualities. One fringe account even claims the Sultan Bayezid II once had a rebellious general locked in this room for 9 days, only to have him emerge speaking in verse and claiming to be a prophet. The general was executed anyway, but not before writing a single line on the chamber wall. Too many faces, none of them mine. You walk past one panel and catch a flash of your own eyes wide, wary, squinting in doubt. The room is designed to wear down your confidence, strip your self-image until it becomes liquid. Many of the punished left unable to recognize their reflection. That wasn't a side effect. That was the point. You reach the center of the chamber now, where a platform rises slightly from the floor. This is where the prisoner sat in a cushion, under a skylight veiled with smoked glass. At midday, the sun would filter through and cast a narrow beam, slicing the room like a blade of judgment. The mirrors caught that light and bounced it around, transforming day into a moving kaleidoscope of self-fragmentation. Sometimes, religious texts were read aloud from behind the wall, echoing into the chamber with no visible source. Other times, silence was maintained for days. The idea was to create a space where nothing made sense. Your body, your voice, even the passage of time. You could not trust what you saw, and so your grip on your identity slipped. A fringe practice involved painting small eyes onto some of the mirrors, hundreds of them, gazing eternally. Prisoners would beg for blindfolds, but none were granted. Face the crime, the guards would say, even when no crime had ever been proven. One famous story involves a eunuch accused of manipulating letters between concubines. Instead of death, he was placed in the mirror chamber for 2 weeks. When released, he refused to enter rooms with polished objects. Even a silver bowl would send him trembling. He eventually escaped the palace, joined a caravan of Sufis, and became a mystic poet writing only in reflections. His verses had to be held up to mirrors to be read. You pause at one mirror that seems oddly clear. It reflects you perfectly, and yet it doesn't. Your eyes seem older, your mouth turned slightly down. You move your hand and notice the reflection lags behind just slightly half a second, just enough to unsettle. You step away. The chamber was never about making people scream. It was about making them see, or think they saw. The difference didn't matter. Some emerged in tears, others laughing. A few claimed to have found divine visions. Most, though, just asked for plain walls, forever after. You duck into a smaller antechamber off the main hall. Here, the mirrors have been covered in drapes. This is the reintegration room, where former prisoners were slowly reintroduced to flat surfaces. They were given ink, paper, and told to draw themselves. Most failed. A few drew animals. One famously drew only shadows. Guards monitored their behavior closely. Could they dress without mirrors? Speak their name without hesitation? Recognize friends, family, their own signature? If not, they were sent back for another reflection. Sometimes just a day, sometimes forever. You return to the center and look up through the skylight. The light filters in weakly now, casting elongated shadows that twist with your movement. You wonder how many faces watched this same circle of light and wondered if the sun itself was mocking them. Wondered if maybe, just maybe, they weren't real anymore. Then you walk away, because that's how the punishment ended. You didn't serve your time. You were told, softly, you may leave, and then left alone to wonder whether the version of you that exited was the same as the one that walked in. The mirror chamber wasn't about justice. It was about transformation. And the worst part? Sometimes it worked. The path out of the mirror chamber leads through a long hall, lined with faded banner silk standards that once shimmered with the colors of conquest, now dulled by centuries of damp air and quiet secrets. You run your hand along one, its embroidery fraying at the edge of a red crescent moon. Every footstep echoes more now, and you sense you're climbing again not just in elevation, but in privilege. You're heading into a punishment that wasn't meted out to ordinary criminals. This one was for the elite, the powerful, the unfortunate few who rose too high in the Ottoman court and forgot that the higher you climb, the more visible your fall. You've entered the chamber of silken strangulation. It sounds beautiful, doesn't it? Silk. So soft, so royal. But here, it spelled the end. A quiet end. A respectable end. The Ottomans called it Boma Sezasithe sentence of strangulation. And while the empire boasted all manner of brutal punishments for peasants, traitors, and blasphemers, this one was reserved for people of status, princes, viziers, even the occasional sultan. You step into a private salon at cold stone or dripping water this time. The floors are inlaid with polished wood, and the cushions are velvet, still plush after all these years. The ceiling domes above, painted with clouds, as if mocking the final breath of every man who died here. At first glance, it feels like a sitting room, a place for afternoon tea, until you notice the hooks along the beams, the silk cords folded neatly in a box, the narrow drain carved discreetly into the floorboards beneath the central rug. You've probably heard that Ottoman royalty was executed with silk cords instead of swords or axes. It's true. They believed that noble blood should not be spilled, and silk-strong, quiet, and untraceable was the perfect tool. You didn't die with a wound. You died looking like you'd simply gone to sleep, and that was the goal. Elegance in death. The executioners, known as Pehlevans, were often mute. Not by accident. They were selected from mute communities, or trained, to keep silence, so that no condemned man would hear his death sentence spoken aloud. The execution was wordless. One nod, one movement, then a quick rap, a pull, a final breath swallowed without ceremony. Historians still argue whether the practice began under Mehmed II or earlier, possibly carried over from Byzantine court traditions. What they do agree on is its consistency. From the 15th century onward, silk and strangulation became the Ottoman go-to for high-ranking purges. It was neat, private, convenient, and it didn't upset the rugs. You examine one of the silk cords now, still wound into a coil like a sleeping snake. It's stronger than it looks. The weave is tight, the ends fitted with wooden toggles for grip. In some executions, 2 men pulled from either end. In others, the condemned was garroted from behind. The silk slipped silently around the neck during a hug or bow. A last show of intimacy before the sudden betrayal. And here's your fringe detail for the night. There was a custom of bringing coffee before the execution, not as a last meal, but as a distraction. The condemned would be offered a warm drink and sometimes even a polite conversation. Then, at the perfect moment when their hands were full, their guard down the cord slipped around their neck. It was called the Sultan's coffee, and once it was served, your fate was sealed. The room itself was often scented. Roses, sandalwood, jasmine. Not for the condemned, but for the witnesses. High-level executions weren't always solitary. In some cases, select officials or palace eunuchs were made to observe, to ensure the act was carried out cleanly. And no one wanted the scent of fear or sweat to linger too long in the imperial halls. One famous story tells of a grand vizier who, after years of service, fell out of favor with the Sultan over an intercepted letter. He was summoned to this very room. Knowing what awaited him, he reportedly removed his turban, straightened his robes, and said, "May your will be carried by hands clean of cruelty." He was dead within 3 minutes. His funeral was held the next day, and his estate quietly seized. The letter? It was later revealed to be a forgery. But by then, the silk had done its job. You step onto the central rug and glance up. The ceiling, painted with blue sky and sunbeams, feels cruel now. How many looked up here as they felt the cord close in? How many prayed, or cursed, or simply closed their eyes? The beauty of the room is deceptive. This wasn't mercy. This was image control. The Ottoman court believed in the theater of power, and that included dignified ends. A messy execution could spark gossip. A bloodless, quiet removal kept order. And in a world where brothers were strangled to protect succession, the silk cord was simply part of royal housekeeping. One of the most chilling uses of this punishment came with the infamous law of fratricide, under which new sultans could legally execute their brothers to prevent civil war. The cords were waiting the moment a prince ascended the throne. Sometimes, the new sultan would hesitate at delaying the act for weeks. Other times, it was carried out before dawn broke on the first day of his reign. A clean slate, they called it. A silent one, too. You find a small scroll tucked behind a cushion-likely ceremonial. It lists names and dates, some crossed out, others circled. Not all were executed. Some were pardoned, others exiled. But the presence of the cord always hovered. Even the possibility of silken death was enough to keep most courtiers very, very obedient. And the cords? They were reused. Cleaned, stored, sometimes even perfumed, but reused. Because silk, like power, was not to be wasted. You walk from the room slowly, your footsteps soundless against the rugs. No echoes here, no cries, just the lingering weight of too many final breaths. You pass through an archway into another hallway, this one lined with portraits, men in turbans, robes, and fine rings. Some smiling, all dead, but not all with blood, some with silk. The empire had many ways to kill, some loud, some quiet, some public, some private. But this was perhaps the most chilling of all, because it pretended to be kind. You descend a twisting staircase now, the kind that feels older than the building itself, so narrow your shoulders brush the walls, so steep you instinctively place one hand against the stone to steady yourself. The temperature drops again, not to the wet chill of the cisterns, but a dry, dusty coolness that clings to your throat. The stairs open into a long passage lit by recessed torches that burn low and quiet, as if unwilling to disturb what lies ahead. You've reached one of the strangest corners of Ottoman punishment, a room so surreal, so animal, that it straddles the line between theatrical cruelty and something out of folklore. This is the chamber of camel skin. You walk into a vaulted chamber, whose floor is lined with heavy woven mats. Hanging from the rafters are shapes-twisted, stitched, sagging shapes like dried gourds or heavy cloaks. But no, these are camel hides, sewn shut along the edges, with rough seams puckered and stained from old use. This wasn't a place for preparing leather. It was for preparing people for an exit from the world more symbolic than swift. The punishment was called dive postuna dikmek, to be sewn into a camel skin. The sentence was as literal as it sounds. A criminal, typically one deemed beyond redemption but unworthy of dignified execution, would be stripped, curled into a fetal position, and sealed inside the cured hide of a camel, hands tied, knees bent, head pressed to chest. Then the skin was sewn shut mouth, limbs, everything, and the package was either left to rot in the sun, rolled into a ditch, or, most famously, tossed into the sea. The horror wasn't always about death. Sometimes, the victim was still alive when the sewing began. Historians still argue over the purpose of this punishment. Was it execution? Was it exile? Was it symbolic rebirth in reversee parody of burial? Some say it was reserved for heretics and spies, people the empire wanted erased both physically and cosmologically. Others claim it originated in Turkic steppe traditions long before the Ottomans rose, a shamanic inversion of a burial rap. Whatever its roots, it was rare but real. And here's a fringe detail. Camel skin, when dried in the sun, tightens. It shrinks, which means that if the person inside was still breathing, the hide would slowly compress them over hours, even days. Crushed not by tools but by nature. It was a punishment that outsourced its violence. You kneel beside one of the skins and see faint stitching holes frayed now but clear. The work wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. It just had to hold. A small hole in one end suggests where the bindings were drawn tight, like the drawstring of a bag. You can't help but wonder who was inside, what they'd done, whether they screamed, whether it made any difference. Some records suggest the punishment was used for crimes of deception, false prophets, impersonators of nobles, even a few failed magicians. One tale describes a man who posed as a long-lost prince, gaining favor with a regional governor. When the truth emerged, the governor was too embarrassed to execute him publicly, so the camel skin method was chosen instead. He was sewn up, his false identity never officially corrected, his disappearance blamed on a religious retreat. Another account, possibly apocryphal, tells of a concubine who conspired with foreign emissaries. Her punishment was performed not in secret, but in view of the harem. The camel skin was paraded through the palace before being thrown into the Golden Horn, a warning wrapped in leather. You stand now beneath one of the hanging skins, imagining the weight of it, the smell, the crushing silence inside. This wasn't just death. This was obliteration. No grave, no prayers, no shroud. The body gone, the name erased, the memory sealed inside something made for cargo, not people. The Ottomans were meticulous with ritual, even in punishment. And yet, this punishment seems almost gleefully anarchic, messy, animalistic. It evokes the wild roots of empire before the marble courts, before the court musicians and velvet strangulation, a reminder that beneath every orderly civilization lies the potential for primitive justice. And still, it had purpose. To be sewn into a camel skin was to be made inhuman. You were placed inside a beast's shell, you took on its shape, and then, when the time came, you were discarded like carrion. It was punishment, as devolution stripping not just rights, but species. No last words, no legacy. Here's an unsettling footnote. Camel skin wasn't the only material used. A few fringe documents mention horse hides, even ox skins. In colder regions, where camels were less common, they used what was available. One remote record from eastern Anatolia describes a local rebel leader sentenced to the cow pouch, tossed into a river beneath a freezing moon. His body never found. His legend, however, lasted far longer. You move toward the far end of the chamber, where a low platform sits surrounded by rusted tools, curved needles, awls, spools of sinew, not for tailoring, for binding. These weren't executioner's weapons, they were cobbler's tools, repurposed into instruments of finality. Somewhere in history, a shoemaker became a death assistant. And then you see the sketch. On the wall, etched crudely in charcoal, the outline of a man inside a curled shape, his eyes wide, his mouth open. Next to it, the word Unutma, do not forget. You linger there, your breath caught in the back of your throat, because the line between justice and warning is so thin here, it's almost poetic. The Ottomans didn't just punish, they curated fear. They designed punishments that outlived the victims, that echoed in story, song, nightmare. The camel skin was just one such echoless common, more surreal, but unforgettable. You exit the chamber slowly, your feet landing a little softer now, as though you don't want the skins to hear you, as though they still might. The empire continues to unfold ahead. More torches, more halls, more rooms soaked in silence. But this one will follow you, like a shadow stitched too tightly to escape. You walk for a while now in near total silence, your footsteps hushed against the faded mosaics beneath you. The air changes again, this time dry and crisp, like parchment and ash. The hallway ahead ends at a massive wooden door, reinforced with bronze studs. It's open just enough to slip through, and when you do, you find yourself standing in a room that feels more like a courtroom than a dungeon. But this place wasn't for trials. It was for penance by flaminate burning, not branding, but something stranger. You've entered the Hall of Ashes, where punishment meant watching yourself disappear, piece by piece. This was the domain of Yakar Tovbe, or burnt repentance. A ritualized punishment designed not to maim, but to erase symbols of pride, status, or past offenses. Here, it wasn't your body that was targeted. It was your possessions, your name, your image. The Empire's version of spiritual defragmentation. The room is round, its center occupied by a low iron pit. Scorch marks radiate outward, like the petals of some grim flower. Above, chimneys funnel smoke upward through the ceiling, elegantly carved to resemble vines, as if pretending this was a garden and not a furnace. Around the pit are small marble benches and niches in the walls, each one marked with a brass plaque naming a person or title. You realize with a slow chill that this was a place for symbolic deaths, a form of bureaucratic exorcism. When a noble or official was found guilty of betrayal, corruption, or spiritual impurity, they were sometimes brought here not to be executed, but to watch their public identity burned. Literally. Robes, medallions, titles inscribed on scrolls, signet ringseech fed to the fire while the accused stood silently by. And then came the final act, the burning of a portrait. Not always a painted one. Sometimes it was a crude likeness drawn just for this purpose. Sometimes just a nameplate, a personal seal, a stylized signature. It would be held up to the flame until it blackened, curled, and vanished. In that moment, the condemned was no longer the person they'd been. The Empire had removed their reflection from the world. And here's the twist. They weren't always imprisoned afterward. Sometimes, they were released, sent into exile, with nothing but their body and the clothes on their back. No title, no connections, no claim to anything. In the Ottoman system, that could be a harsher fate than death. To lose your identity was to lose access, community, and meaning. You still breathed. Yes, but you no longer mattered. Historians still argue whether Yakar Tovbey began as a punishment or as a purification rite. Some see it as spiritual theater. Others believe it was meant to satisfy public outrage without shedding blood. It offered closure, dramatic, symbolic, final. A man might walk out of the Hall of Ashes alive, but with no past to his name. In effect, he was a ghost. One particularly strange case involved a palace astrologer who had predicted the death of a sultan and been correct. This made him simultaneously revered and feared. The new sultan didn't dare kill him outright, fearing backlash. Instead, he summoned him here. His robes were burned, his charts incinerated. His astrological instruments melted down. He was allowed to live, but forbidden to ever draw a star map again. He later wandered the bazaars under a new name, giving fortune readings to farmers. Some said he never spoke above a whisper after that day. A fringe tale tells of a woman from the harem rumored to be the mother of a prince who was punished in this room after being accused of sorcery. Her mirror, combs, even strands of her hair were fed to the flame. Her identity was erased so thoroughly that when she died years later, she was buried under a false name. Her actual title, still unknown. You approach the fire pit and peer in. It's cold now, but the ash at the bottom is thick and undisturbed. Resting atop it is a charred ring-blackened silver with the faint outline of a crescent. Someone's last badge of belonging. You don't touch it. It doesn't want to be touched. The punishment was often performed with witness escort scribes, palace guards, or even members of the imperial family. The process was formal. A list was read aloud of the items to be destroyed. Then the condemned was asked a single question: do you repent? The answer didn't matter. The fire still came, but the ritual demanded it. A script had to be followed. Punishment had to feel like theater, even when the ending was already decided. And here's your eerie detail. Sometimes, the burning included a small effigy, a doll or figure carved from wood or wax, stylized to resemble the condemned. Not for curses, at least not officially, but to burn alongside the items. To ensure completeness. Some say these figures were made by palace children, instructed only to carve someone who no longer belongs. The psychological impact? Devastating. You look around and notice alcoves behind draped curtains. Inside each are rows of empty display boxes cases that once held the items of those sentenced here. The cases aren't labeled. There's no need. Their owners are gone. The empire didn't catalog shame. It reduced it to cinders. And yet, some tried to escape even this. One high-ranking admiral, when informed of his coming punishment, destroyed his own portrait and burned his family records before the guards arrived. He was brought here anyway, given a blank scroll. The scribe wrote his name on it, then burned it. Symbolism doesn't need authenticity to work. You pass a panel on the wall, carved with a single sentence. Ash does not argue. It's the kind of phrase that sounds poetic until you realize how flatly final it is. In this room, arguments ended. Even identities ended. All that remained was smoke. You take one last look at the fire pit. You imagine the faces that stood here, some proud, some shaking, some already hollowed out before the flame ever touched a thing. And you realize that sometimes the worst punishment isn't death. It's becoming no one. And in the Ottoman Empire, even that fate had its place. Even that silence had structure. You step out of the Hall of Ashes. No soot on your fingers. No name burned behind you. But the air still smells faintly of memory. The corridor ahead curves left, then right, then narrows again until you're walking single file with yourself. The walls grow rougher, carved less neatly, with cracks running like veins along the surface. You're climbing upward once more, toward a part of the palace few dared approach without reason. This wasn't a place for punishment exactly, but for those who enforced it. You're now entering the home of death itself, wrapped in human form, This is the island of the executioner. The Ottomans had a peculiar relationship with their state-sanctioned killers. On one hand, they were essential trained professionals, often skilled in swordplay, anatomy, and timing. On the other, they were pariahs, tainted by the work they did, even feared by those who employed them. As a result, they were segregated from everyday palace life, not just spiritually or socially, but geographically. Some lived outside the palace walls, in quarters just beyond the city gates. Others, according to long-standing belief, were housed on a secluded patch of land across the Bosphorus, an isolated retreat unofficially known as Kelet Adassa Executioner's Island. You reach a narrow bridge, now low, wooden, and misty, and step onto the imaginary soil of that island. There are no grand buildings here, no marble towers or domes, just wooden houses, low-roofed and spare. Gardens grow along the edges, their plants practical lavender, thyme, sage, useful for scrubbing blood from skin and scent from hands. This was where the executioners lived, ate, trained, and were buried. Not among the regular dead, of course. Their cemeteries were separate, marked by blank stones with no names. In the Empire's official memory, these men did not exist. Yet here they were. Many of them, training daily with silent discipline, waiting for orders sent from the palace like cold wind across the water. Historians still argue whether the island was real or metaphorical. Some maps show no such place. Others mark it faintly, usually with a skull symbol or just a blank space. But accounts persist, memoirs, court documents, even Ottoman poetry, all referencing a place where the men of silence live. Whether real or not, its presence loomed in the imperial imagination, like a shadow shaped into land. And here's your strange tidbit. Executioners weren't always born into the role. Many were criminals themselves, offered freedom in exchange for service. Others were orphans or slaves, trained from youth in anatomy and obedience. Once accepted into the order, they were given new names, never their birth names, and forbidden from marrying or speaking their origins. They became vessels, efficient, precise, emotionless. One former executioner, years after retiring, reportedly said, "I do not remember the faces, only the weight." He meant heads, of course. The act of carrying them wrapped in silk, sometimes in baskets, sometimes presented on platters, but perhaps also the weight of what it meant to erase a life and keep walking. The executioners had their own rules. They were forbidden from entering mosques during services, forbidden from sitting at public tables, forbidden from owning dogs, oddly enough. Some say it was to avoid companionship. Others think it was because dogs, being loyal, might develop affection for men whom no one else could love. You step into one of the wooden homes, simple, clean, almost monastic. A cot, a basin, a row of swords hung like tools. One is curved, sharp along the inside edge, meant for beheading in a single clean stroke. The others are smaller, used for fingers, ears, tongues. Every blade labeled in quiet script, not with names, but with numbers. Some executioners became so skilled they could kill without visible, injury-precise pressure to arteries, perfect positioning of the silk cord. They were artists of oblivion. One famous master could strangle a man to death without creasing his robes. He later trained others, his techniques recorded in a now-lost manual known only by its rumored title, The Quiet Way. But death, of course, is not a quiet companion. Executioners were plagued by dreams so many that the palace employed special dream interpreters just for them. Recurring nightmares, strange symbols, sleeplessness. One journal describes an executioner haunted for years by the sound of bells that didn't exist. He was eventually granted early retirement and buried anonymously. His tombstone was shaped like a bell. And yes, when executioners retired, they weren't released into society. They often remained on the island or were transferred to distant provinces to live in quiet exile. Their pensions were generous but conditional. They were never to write memoirs, never to speak of specific deaths, and never, ever to return to the capital. Their hands had touched too much empire to be allowed back into its heart. Still, some did write. Fragments survive coded letters, anonymous poetry, etched lines on the walls of tea-houses. One verse reads, "I once carved silence into kings. Now I carve wood." Another, more chilling. "I watched a man's eyes for 10 seconds after death. I wish I hadn't." You pass a training courtyard, its floor covered in sand to muffle sound. At the center stands a practice post with painted target's neck, spine, shoulder. This was where they honed their skill to eliminate, not torture. That distinction mattered. The Ottoman executioner wasn't meant to inflict pain. He was meant to bring resolution. And yet, some were called for punishments beyond killing: mutilation, blinding, branding. Punishments so refined they needed steady hands. Executioners didn't just end lives, they reshaped them. They silenced voices. They removed eyes. They erased legacy. As you step out again toward the imaginary dock, the mist thickens. The island blurs behind you, becoming legend once more, a half-fact cloaked in silence, like the men who lived there. Executioners were both ghosts and guardians, necessary, feared, despised, and occasionally admired. They lived on the periphery of the city, of society, of history, and though their names are gone, their work is everywhere. In the hush of a silken room, in the polished marble where no stain remains, in the invisible edge between order and chaos, they kept the empire neat. At a price, you walk now with a sense of finality, as though your feet understand that this is the last corridor. There's no grand marble hallway this time, no opulence, no gilded ceiling, just a long, sloping ramp carved out of worn stone, leading you steadily upward. The walls are damp again, but not unpleasantly so. There's a breeze here, a shifting current that carries whispers you can't quite make out, like words drifting over the water. And that's when you feel it. The sea. You're nearing the edge of the empire, the place where it all dissolves into salt and sky. The final punishment waits here not for a person, but for the memory of everything that came before. You've arrived at the Ghost Gate, the place where the echoes of Ottoman justice linger long after the rope has snapped and the fire has gone out. At the top of the ramp is a flat, open Spacino roof, just the pale wash of early dawn creeping over the horizon. This is not a prison cell, not a torture chamber. It's a platform. You walk slowly across its smooth surface, noticing faint scorches, faint bloodstains, and other marks too old to name. This was a place of ending. Public, dramatic, silent. Here is where condemned souls met the final moment of the empire's will. The Ottomans were masters of silence, but when they wanted spectacle, they did it with ruthless poetry. Executions weren't always private affairs. Sometimes they were choreographed swords catching the sunrise, drums rolling low, eyes fixed on the center where one figure stood alone. A scribe might be there, quill ready to note the last words. A muezzin might call out a final prayer, and then silk cord, blade, shove from the tower whatever method the moment called for. But this place, this high edge above the Bosphorus, where the empire turned death into myth. Some were pushed, others leapt. Some were simply stood here, told their name would never be spoken again, and left to walk away into nowhere. Historians still argue whether this place was official. Some say it never existed, that it's just a tale told by fishermen watching lights flicker at the palace edge. But others point to architectural plans, old etchings, even sailor journals that reference the ledge of forgetting. Whether real or not, it holds its place in memory. And that's what punishment is sometimes about, making sure people remember the forgetting. You stand now where they say a grand vizier once took his own life, stepping off the edge before the Sultan's order reached him. Honor or fear of disgrace? No one knows. His last words were supposedly, "I give myself back to the empire." Dramatic, sure, but not out of place here. A breeze picks up, lifting your hair slightly, and with it comes a strange scent. Cloves, ash, maybe even rosewater. Punishment here wasn't just meant to hurt, it was meant to linger. A signature you couldn't scrub off your soul. The Ottomans were obsessed with balance. Crime met with consequence. Disobedience answered with silence. But toward the end, when the empire weakened, when borders shrank and rebellion stirred, that balance began to fray. Some punishments grew desperate. Others were abandoned, and some, like this final platform, became more symbolic than practical, a stage for a dying world to watch itself vanish. And here's your last strange detail. The final official executioner of the Ottoman Empire retired in the early 20th century. His tools were boxed up and sent to a museum that never displayed them. His home was demolished. His burial place remains unknown, just like his victims, just like the cords and swords and silk-soaked confessions, all tucked into the same dark drawer history keeps for things it doesn't want to explain. As the sun rises higher, the city beyond begins to stir. But up here, everything stays still. You can almost hear the rustle of a long coat, the whisper of last prayers, the creak of leather boots approaching the edge. Ghosts don't make noise, but they make you feel, and maybe that's the real punishment. Not the flaying, the boiling, the blinding, not the exile, the strangling, the endless march through dust and regret. Maybe it's the knowing that the empire didn't just kill people, it curated their silence. It filed away their screams into neat little boxes and let the world forget them one by one. You sit for a moment now, at the very edge. Below, the Bosphorus glimmers like a sleeping serpent. Boats cut across its glassy surface, unaware of what once happened above them. Unaware that just behind that stone rail, men with names and hopes and silk cords once stood waiting for permission to vanish. So you listen. To the city, to the ghosts, to the quiet, brutal history you've walked through. You breathe it in, rose and ash, iron and incense. And now, as the final light spills over the ledge, let's bring this journey to a close. You're still there, sitting quietly, legs folded beneath you, the world slowed to a hush. The sun is rising now, soft and gold, not fiery or dramatic, but patient. It spills gently across the stone, turning the old marks into faded hieroglyphs no one can quite read anymore. The water below laps rhythmically against invisible shores. Even the birds seem to understand this isn't a moment for noise. You let your eyes drift closed. There's no need to remember every punishment now. No need to replay the corridors, the chambers, the cords, the cries. It's all dissolving now slowly, steadily like candle wax melting into a table, unnoticed until it's gone. The executioners have gone home. The halls are dark. The scrolls have rolled themselves shut. It's just you now. You, and a sky turning paler by the second, and the weight of 1,000 forgotten stories, pressing not hard, but gently, as if asking not to be feared, just acknowledged. Let that weight settle. Let it ground you. Inhale slowly, deeply. Let the strange shapes of Ottoman cruelty fade into silhouettes behind your eyelids. Let your thoughts scatter like ashes from the Hall of Repentance, drifting wherever the breeze decides. You're safe now. The empire has gone quiet. Its punishments, its echoes, its silk and sword faded. What remains is the hush, the stillness. Let that stillness carry you wherever you need to go tonight. You did well walking this far. Now rest. Sweet dreams.